Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Liana Friedenbach and Felipe Café. At the end of 2003, teenagers Liana Friedenbach and Felipe Café planned a hiking trip to spend time together in nature. They were a young couple in love, having dated for several months while attending the same school. However, their parents disapproved of their relationship, forbidding them from going on dates or engaging in such adventures. Determined to stay together, they came up with a plan to mislead their families. Felipe told his family he was going hiking with friends, while Liana claimed she would be spending the weekend with church friends in Ilhabela. Their parents believed these stories. The plan seemed flawless, offering them the chance to spend several days alone together. They chose the countryside of Embu-Guaçu, located in the greater São Paulo region of Brazil, as their retreat. What was meant to be a peaceful and romantic getaway tragically took a horrific turn when they crossed paths with a group of dangerous individuals. Although deceiving their parents was not easy, Liana and Felipe succeeded and were overjoyed to finally be together in a place free from interference. Their relationship had always faced resistance from their families, limiting their time together to brief interactions at school. The opposition was likely due to their ages. Liana was 16, while Felipe was 19 at the time. They began their trip on October 31, 2003. The journey was long and arduous, but Liana and Felipe were determined to overcome every obstacle. With limited financial resources, they relied on free travel privileges and took public transportation to reach São Paulo. Starting early in the morning to avoid suspicion, they arrived at the São Paulo bus station by 5 a.m. on October 31st and waited for their next bus. By around 9 a.m., they reached Embu-Guaçu, where they transferred to another bus heading towards Santa Rita, a small rural village near an abandoned site they planned to explore. From there, they made the final stretch on foot to reach their destination. This abandoned location was isolated and deserted, making it an ideal retreat for them. Believing it to be the perfect spot to relax, they walked approximately 4.5 kilometers to reach the site and set up a tent under the shelter of a dilapidated, abandoned structure. Full of excitement for their week-long getaway in this tranquil hideaway, they savored every moment together. However, the area was not as private as they had hoped. During their journey, they traveled through a forest community inhabited by impoverished locals. Liana's beauty, their neat and stylish appearance, and the bags they carried made them stand out. The locals assumed they were wealthy visitors coming to enjoy some leisure time in the forest. Nearby, a group of men was fishing. Among them were Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, nicknamed Pernambuco, and Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, nicknamed Champagna. Both were members of a gang led by Champagna. While they were fishing, they saw Liana and Felipe setting up camp in the middle of the wilderness. Fueled by sinister intentions, they began devising a horrific plan. Later that afternoon, Pernambuco and Champagna launched an attack on Liana and Felipe. Before making their move, they observed the couple closely to ensure they were alone and unarmed. Once assured, they launched their assault. Initially, they assumed that Liana and Felipe were wealthy and possessed valuables worth stealing. They initially assumed that Liana and Felipe were wealthy and would have valuables worth stealing. However, it quickly became apparent that the couple carried neither money nor jewelry. Though frustrated, they were unwilling to abandon their scheme and decided on a different course of action. Pernambuco and Champagna kidnapped Liana and Felipe with the intention of demanding a ransom for their release. With no clear plan or capacity to develop one, the criminals hastily took Liana and Felipe to an abandoned house near the campsite. The location was grim and filthy, setting the stage for the unspeakable horrors that awaited them. After evaluating the surroundings, Pernambuco and Champagna concluded that the house was neither secure enough to hold Liana and Felipe nor adequately supervised. Because of this, they decided to leave and search for a more suitable location. Liana and Felipe were quickly moved to another spot within the same area. This new place was owned by an acquaintance of theirs, who later joined their group. Despite the presence of the owner, the house was in deplorable condition, dirty, chaotic, and completely unsanitary. Nonetheless, Pernambuco and Champagnat deemed it more suitable for their purposes. Liana informed Pernambuco and Champagnat that she was from a wealthy family and proposed that they demand a ransom in exchange for her release. This claim was true. Liana was the daughter of Ari Friedenbach, a well-known and respected lawyer in the city, and her family was wealthy. Pernambuco and Champagnat were thrilled by this revelation, believing it to be a lucrative opportunity. During the night, Liana and Felipe were bound and confined in separate rooms of the house. Pernambuco and Champagnat assaulted Liana, while her boyfriend Felipe, who was confined in the adjacent room, could hear her cries but was powerless to intervene, as he had been restrained and severely beaten. Stunned and shocked, Liana barely resisted and fervently prayed for the suffering to end swiftly. Liana and Felipe endured relentless torture and beatings. The following day, they were taken into the forest. However, Liana was not the first victim. After some time, Pernambuco and Felipe split off from the group and ventured further into the woods. There, Pernambuco quickly attacked Felipe using weapons. His body was later discovered on a forest trail near the site of his captivity. He had been forced to kneel with his hands tied behind his back before being attacked in the head from behind. Pernambuco and Champagnat had learned that Felipe came from a modest family, which meant there would be no ransom paid for him. This disappointed them. Additionally, they saw him as a potential obstacle and liability, which led them to decide to kill him as soon as possible. Liana was not present during the killing, she had stayed behind. However, she heard the weapon and was shocked to realize they had attacked Felipe. When she inquired about what had happened to Felipe, they responded that he had been released. Liana knew better than to believe that and understood that the kidnappers wouldn't take such a risk. What she didn't realize in that moment was that her own time was running out. Liana was left alone with Pernambuco and Champagnat, both of whom refused to follow her advice and never made ransom demands to her father. They lacked the ability to organize everything anonymously and avoid detection. These incompetent criminals, driven by greed, attempted a kidnapping but failed miserably. Now, they were unsure of what to do with Liana. On one hand, they wanted to keep the beautiful girl for themselves and enjoy her company for a while. On the other hand, they feared that people would start searching for her and realized they needed to get rid of her soon. 3 days after Liana and Felipe had left, Liana's father, Ari Friedenbach, discovered their real plan when he tried to contact her. He learned that Liana wasn't with a group of friends from the church as she had claimed. Furious, he realized that they had secretly run off together. His inability to reach either his daughter or Felipe raised serious concerns for both him and her mother. Neither parent could imagine the nightmare their 16-year-old daughter was enduring at that moment. Using all of his resources, Ari worked to track down his daughter's whereabouts. He found out that Liana and Felipe had reached Sao Paulo and entered the forest, where their phones were last pinged. A friend of Liana and Felipe confirmed the information but did not know the exact location of their camp. Despite the lack of specifics, this was still a lead. Ari submitted a report to law enforcement regarding the disappearance of Liana and Felipe, prompting the police to begin their investigation. Ari leveraged all of his connections to expedite the search for his daughter in the dense forest. A rescue team promptly arrived at the location reported by the friends of Liana and Felipe. They quickly found Liana and Felipe's abandoned campsite, which displayed troubling signs: a torn tent and scattered belongings. There were clear signs that something serious had happened here, as the tent appeared to have been cut open with a knife. This suggested human intervention, leading the police to suspect that they might have been attacked or kidnapped. At the site, investigators discovered clothing, Liana's wallet, and her discharged mobile phone. The search continued into the forest, and tragically, they discovered the body of her boyfriend, Felipe. This discovery heightened fears and diminished hope of finding Liana alive. Meanwhile, at the house where Liana was being held captive, the owner, Antonio Caetano Silva, arrived with his friend, Agnaldo Pires. Champagnat, the kidnapper, told them that Liana was his girlfriend. Shockingly, he offered her to his friend, and the offer was accepted. Agnaldo and Antonio abused and tortured Liana repeatedly. Back at home, Liana's father, upon learning of Felipe's murder, took action. Determined to find his daughter, he mobilized the national press to bring attention to the case. The search efforts intensified due to growing public attention. A businessman, moved by the tragedy, contributed to the operation by using his helicopter to distribute 5,000 leaflets with photographs of Felipe and Liana across the region. Photos of Liana and Felipe were widely circulated, but sadly, no useful information could be gathered. Despite an attractive reward, local residents could provide no helpful information about their whereabouts. Several people reported seeing a couple in the woods, prompting volunteers and search teams to focus on checking the area near the teenagers' abandoned camp. Meanwhile, Champaña, Antonio and Agnaldo assumed that Liana might be searched for in the forest and decided to quickly leave the area. The next day, they took her and traveled to Antonio Matias de Barros's house, the first homeowner. Acting as though nothing had happened, they went fishing with Liana, convinced they would remain undetected. Champaña even lent her his sweatshirt during this time. By the end of the day, Champaña's older brother visited him because their parents were worried about his absence from home. Champaña introduced Liana as his girlfriend there, proudly showcasing her beauty and expressing his pride in having such a stunning girl by his side. However, his brother knew that Liana had been kidnapped but failed to report it to the police. During their conversation, the brother warned the group that authorities were searching the area intensively for her and had deployed significant resources. This alarmed the kidnappers, who realized rescuers might be close. Feeling the pressure, the kidnappers decided to flee. Champaña then resolved to kill Liana to prevent her from identifying them, though he lied to her and the others, claiming he would take her to the bus station and leave her there. At dawn, Champaña led Liana into a dense forest under the pretense of taking her to safety. Instead, he attacked her with a fishing knife on November 5, 2003. He stabbed her multiple times, beginning with a fatal wound to her neck that caused severe blood loss. As Liana fell and tried to cover the injury with her hand, Champaña continued to stab her chest, head, and back. He then struck her with a large stone on her head, killing her instantly. Only after confirming her death did he leave the gruesome scene, and the group of criminals fled. Champaña returned home, changed his clothes, wrapped the bloody knife in a rag, and hid it in a well near his house. He hoped that the incriminating evidence would not be discovered. However, 5 days later, on November 10th, Liana's body was found in a forest. She was still wearing Champaña's sweatshirt, which contained his DNA. Police were able to track the movements of the attackers and their victim, Liana. They visited all the huts where the kidnappers had stayed and successfully identified those involved. They promptly identified the perpetrators and determined their present location. Champaña and his accomplices were arrested within a few days. At Champaña's house, investigators found bloody clothing and the knife used in the crime. Tests confirmed that the blood on the objects belonged to Liana, and the items also contained Champaña's DNA. Champaña immediately confessed to the crime, proudly admitting that he had kidnapped and stabbed Liana simply because he wanted to. He explained that he was attracted to Liana and desired to treat her like a doll, a possession he could control entirely. However, circumstances forced him to kill her due to the police pursuit. He then detailed the complete chronology of Liana and Felipe's kidnapping. Despite being only 16 years old, Champaña was the leader of the group of juvenile criminals, which included adult accomplices. He was the same age as Liana, but his young age meant authorities handled his sentencing differently. According to the laws of the state, the gang's leader and instigator of this heinous crime was sent to a correctional facility for minors located in the northern part of São Paulo. As per legislation concerning minors who commit crimes, Champaña would remain in the facility until he turned 21. The trial of the criminals began in July 2006. Following the investigation, Antonio Caetano da Silva was sentenced to 124 years in prison for the multiple abuses of Liana. Another participant, Agnaldo Pires, was sentenced to 47 years for abuse, while Antonio Matias de Barros received a 7-year and 9-month sentence for violently detaining Liana and concealing evidence. The trial of the main defendants, Pernambuco and Champaña, lasted the longest, concluding in November 2007. Thanks to Liana's father actively bringing the case to public attention through the media, It gained significant publicity in Brazil and shocked the public with the atrocious acts committed by juvenile offenders against Liana and Felipe. As a result of the trial, Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, Pernambuco, was sentenced to 110 years in prison for the premeditated murder of Felipe, as well as for illegal detention and kidnapping. The case of Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, Champaña, presented additional challenges due to his status as a minor. As the gang leader, he remained in a juvenile correctional facility. His erratic and aggressive behavior led to multiple psychiatric evaluations organized by his lawyers. They argued that Champaña's impoverished upbringing and difficult childhood influenced his actions. Doctors diagnosed him with mild mental retardation and antisocial personality disorder, conditions that individually pose risks to society but, together, made him excessively dangerous. Champaña was moved to an experimental medical facility designed for rehabilitating criminals with mental disorders, as a harsher legal penalty was not permissible in his case. Despite this reasoning, the public was outraged by the leniency of the punishment and demanded he face long-term incarceration. Public indignation sparked a global debate on reforming the criminal justice system, though these changes did not affect Champaña since his crime occurred before the amendments were enacted. He remains in the medical institution under the care of the regional government. Although the crime was brutal, Champaña, the leader of the kidnappers, has shown no remorse for his actions. He has repeatedly petitioned the courts for release, claiming he has undergone treatment and no longer poses a threat. These requests have been denied by 3 separate courts, especially as he has made no effort to prove he has reformed. Remarkably, in 2007, early one morning, he managed to escape from the facility. With the help of an accomplice, he climbed a 7-meter wall using a ladder. However, law enforcement acted swiftly, capturing him 11 hours later before he could harm anyone. Champaña was returned to the medical institution promptly. Despite committing numerous heinous crimes, Champaña's circumstances are surprisingly comfortable. On December 17, 2007, a television report revealed that he was living in a cozy apartment within a medical facility. His accommodations included a comfortable sofa, a large 29-inch TV, and 5 meals a day prepared according to a personalized menu designed by a nutritionist. These living conditions starkly contrast with the anguish endured by his victims, Liana and Felipe, in their final days. The governor at the time justified these arrangements, claiming that isolating Champaña in this way was the safest method to prevent harm to society while managing his dangerous behavior through hospitalization. Experts estimate that keeping Champaña detained costs the state approximately $2,500 per month. Yet, lawyers argued that his forced detention is unconstitutional and pushed for his release. Meanwhile, Liana's and Felipe's families were devastated by their loss, as the tragedy shattered their lives. For example, Liana's parents were so overwhelmed by grief that they eventually divorced. These families fought hard to ensure justice and succeeded in bringing punishment to most of those involved in the crimes. Yet the main perpetrator, Champaña, escaped serious consequences and now lives in conditions far more comfortable than those he experienced before his hospitalization. This case sparked significant public outcry, leading to calls for lowering the age of criminal responsibility to 16. The proposal generated both support and opposition, resulting in active debate. Ultimately, these amendments were approved. Currently, Champaña is not in a prison serving a criminal sentence but is instead held indefinitely in a hospital on civil grounds due to his mental disorders, with approval from doctors and authorities. This arrangement is justified by his continued threat to society. A retrial for the crimes he committed against Liana and Felipe is no longer an option, as the country's criminal code prohibits punishing someone for the same offense twice. Consequently, Champaña remains in the hospital's relatively comfortable conditions to this day. Hi everyone, thanks for returning. Let's unravel another perplexing mystery. The case of Carrie Leah Farver. Carrie Leah Farver was born on November 30, 1974 in Macedonia, Nebraska, USA. After going through many relationships, she raised her son Maxwell alone. Carrie Leah loved her son very much. Carrie Leah spent a month in bed due to severe depression. Her mother, Nancy Rainey, helped take care of her son Maxwell. The complicated relationship with Maxwell's father along with the difficult living conditions caused Carrie Leah, a young woman of 20 years old, to fall into an unstable psychological state. Doctors diagnosed Carrie Leah with bipolar disorder. People with bipolar disorder often have two opposite psychological states. One moment they can feel overly excited, energetic and friendly, but then they can fall into a state of depression, frustration and helplessness. This disease causes them a lot of difficulties in daily life. However, in the early 2000s, Carrie Leah's doctor found an effective treatment that allowed Carrie Leah to live a normal life. In the fall of 2012, Carrie Leah received a lucrative job offer in nearby Omaha, an opportunity she couldn't refuse. Carrie Leah accepted the offer. However, her son, Maxwell, was in middle school and didn't want to change his familiar surroundings, so Maxwell decided to stay with his grandmother in Macedonia. One day in November 2012, Carrie Leah met Dave Kropa at the auto repair shop where he worked. When Dave looked at Carrie Leah's Ford Explorer, he realized that he really liked this woman. Carrie Leah was showing Dave something inside the car, and they stood close to each other, and there was a little tension. Not long after, Dave and Carrie Leah went on a date. Carrie Leah went to Dave's house. A while later, a woman named Liz called Dave a lot and texted him. Then Liz went to Dave's house to pick up something he had left for her. Dave explained to Carrie Leah that Liz Gollier was the first person Dave met online in 2012. Liz, born in 1975 in Michigan, initially told Dave that she was not looking for a serious relationship because she was a mother and needed to spend most of her time with her children. In Dave and Liz's relationship, they had few topics to talk about, and their relationship was mainly physical. After a while, Liz began to worry about what Dave was doing when she was not around, as well as who he was seeing. Dave often reminded her that they were in an open relationship and that she should not worry. He also insisted that Liz was free to date other men. However, Liz was not happy with this and began to bother Dave more and more. Liz also felt jealous of Dave's children and their mother, Amy, because she could not understand the close relationship they had after the breakup. Eventually, Liz's actions upset Dave, and he decided to break up with her. Carrie Leah sympathized with Dave, as everyone had relationships in the past, and Carrie Leah did not let that affect their relationship, but Liz was clearly upset to see a strange woman in Dave's house. Liz, feeling that Dave was increasingly distancing himself from her, wrote text messages, emails, and called Dave. However, Dave would not stop seeing Carrie Leah or anyone else because of Liz. 2 weeks after moving to her new job, Carrie Leah began dating Dave. Carrie Leah and Dave began spending more time together. Dave felt comfortable with Carrie Leah around. Carrie Leah said that she was not looking for a serious relationship, but just wanted to enjoy the good times together. In December 2015, Liz was shot. Liz probably guessed who it was. Luckily, the wound was not fatal. Liz thought, "This can't go on any longer, I have to do something." At 9:45 a.m. at work, Dave suddenly received a text message from Carrie Leah. In the message, Carrie Leah expressed her desire to live with Dave forever. The content of the message made Dave feel confused and surprised, because he did not understand the reason for Carrie Leah's sudden change. Because before, they had discussed and agreed that both of them would not rush into a binding relationship. Dave gently replied to Carrie Leah that he was not ready for this big change. Carrie Leah's response was very unpleasant. When Dave returned to the apartment, he found that all of Carrie Leah's belongings that she had brought were gone. This made him think that Carrie Leah had left him. On the same day, Carrie Leah deleted him from her Facebook friend list. Although it seemed like everything was over, it was not. Dave began receiving a series of text messages and emails from Carrie Leah, which were full of curses and threats to ruin Dave's life. The messages were numerous and all of them were rude. In addition, Carrie Leah did not show up for work. The strange messages from Carrie Leah were not only sent to Dave, but also to her mother and 15-year-old son. In May 2013, Carrie Leah posted a lengthy post on her personal Facebook page, in which she wrote, "She had answered enough questions to prove to everyone that she had had enough. You can either believe that she was a girl, or leave her alone. She quit her volunteer job and she was fed up with people giving her a hard time. She just didn't want to go home right now. She was a grown woman, and if she wanted to leave home, she had every right to do so. Sorry for hurting everyone." Carrie Leah then remained absent for a while. Her mother realized something was wrong when Carrie Leah missed her own birthday, Max's birthday, and other family celebrations. Finally, when her father passed away. After a while, Liz Gollier began receiving messages from Carrie Leah. In those messages, Carrie Leah criticized and insulted Liz, even threatened Liz to stay away from Dave. To understand Carrie Leah's strange behavior, Liz contacted Dave. He said he was also in a similar situation. Carrie Leah sent him many messages and emails, in which Carrie Leah accused Dave of all kinds of wrongdoing, called him a liar, and promised to avenge the pain he had caused Carrie Leah. Gradually, the messages from Carrie Leah became more threatening, with confusing content and grammatical errors. Carrie Leah's mother insists that her daughter is not a hot-tempered person and has always been very careful in writing letters and documents. Carrie Leah pays attention to spelling and presentation. Is her bipolar disorder relapsing and developing into something more serious? After Carrie Leah's confusing actions, all the evidence points to Carrie Leah having psychological difficulties. Liz and Dave often receive hundreds of text messages and emails, even when they are together. Their phones constantly buzz with messages, which makes them both uncomfortable. Although they continue to date, Dave feels uncomfortable around Liz. She becomes more and more demanding, despite always insisting that Liz is fine with their no-strings-attached relationship. In January 2013, Dave found Carrie Leah's car in his front yard. Dave called the police and reported the incident. The police came to check the car and found no suspicious signs. The police then turned the car over to Carrie Leah's parents. Carrie Leah continued to text Dave and Liz. Carrie Leah even started sending pictures of Dave's children and threatening to harm them. As time went on, Carrie Leah continued to stalk them. Liz became increasingly jealous, made Dave angry and tired of the situation, and finally decided to end the relationship with Liz. In August 2013, Liz reported a fire at her house, which killed all of her pets, including a snake, a cat, and 2 dogs. Liz told the police that Carrie Leah had repeatedly threatened her through text messages and emails. So she suspected Carrie Leah of starting the fire. The police seized Dave and Liz's cell phones. Someone damaged Dave's auto repair shop and threw a brick through the window. Dave felt threatened, so he bought a gun to protect himself. After a while, Amy Flora, Dave's ex-wife, also began receiving threatening messages from Carrie Leah, because Dave often spent time with the children and met Amy. The police became suspicious for reasons that were hard to understand. Dave had only dated Carrie Leah for less than 2 weeks, but had been following him and his ex-girlfriends for 3 years. Meanwhile, Carrie Leah's family had not seen her for 3 years, and were trying to find her, using every method possible. In 2015, these efforts paid off. Police officers Ryan Avis and Jim Doty volunteered to investigate Carrie Leah Farver's disappearance. However, they found no evidence that Carrie Leah was alive. It was unusual for an adult to pack up and leave without spending any money. No one had seen her, and no one had heard her voice. This was very strange. With the assistance of Anthony Kawa, digital forensics administrator at the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office, police analyzed the contents of Dave and Liz's phones. In 2013, Anthony reported that Carrie Leah Farver had sent more than 50,000 text messages and 15,000 emails to Dave over the course of 3 years. Anthony also said that those impersonating Carrie Leah were becoming more sophisticated in their operations, trying to hide their IP addresses and real identities. It seems that someone knew what they were doing and had access to various computer programs. In December 2015, Liz Gollier contacted the police to report that she had been shot in the leg outside her home. She determined that the attacker was not Carrie Leah but Dave's ex-wife Amy Flora. Furthermore, Dave had a missing gun that Amy may have taken. It is possible that Amy was behind Carrie Lee's disappearance. A clue in the investigation indicates that people associated with Dave were being harassed. It is possible that Amy, having had a difficult life after breaking up with Dave, the father of her children, decided to take revenge and eliminate all rivals, and the relationship between Dave and Amy was still quite good. The children together brought them closer, and Carrie Leah clearly hindered their reunion. The police quickly questioned Amy, but surprisingly, Amy had an alibi. She was not at Liz's house when the shooting occurred, and this was confirmed by several people. Because there was no hard evidence, Amy was not arrested. Experts processed the data from Liz's cell phone and discovered important information. Anthony discovered fake email addresses with different variations of the name Carrie Leah. In addition, Anthony found an application that Carrie Leah used to schedule messages to be sent at certain times. This could explain why Liz and Dave received messages from Carrie Leah at the same time. Anthony began to suspect Liz Gollier. The answer became clear when Liz's fingerprints were compared to those found on the steering wheel of Carrie Lee's car, and they matched perfectly. The culprit was revealed. The killer has been here for years without anyone knowing. The case needs to be solved as soon as possible. The police want to catch Liz red-handed, so they plan to frame Liz. The police decide to make up a story about believing Liz, with Amy still being the main suspect. Liz takes the bait. Liz is extremely happy because she can finally get rid of another rival who is hindering Liz's happiness with Dave. Soon after, Liz gives the police an email that she says is from Amy. In the email, Amy admits to kidnapping Carrie Leah and includes many details about the incident. The confession in the email states that Carrie Leah was stabbed in the stomach or chest before being dumped. In addition, the email contains information about Carrie Lee's car and home address that no one else knows. The police say that Liz has provided information that only the real culprit would know. The email messages clearly indicated that the crime had taken place in a car, so the police decided to re-examine Carrie Lee's car. After the police removed the upholstery and fabric, they discovered blood stains belonging to Carrie Leah, who had gone missing. Liz had created fake messages on Carrie Lee's behalf without raising suspicion. According to the investigation, Liz Gollier dated both Dave and a man named Garrett. Garrett lived at the IP address identified as the source of the messages under Carrie Lee's name. When talking to Garrett, the police discovered that he had been in a long-term relationship with Shanana Gollier, known to many as Liz. Garrett had invited Liz to live with his children after a fire. However, their relationship became complicated and strained when they lived together, with Garrett having to care for Liz's children while she was away. Garrett was surprised to hear from police that Liz had spent 40 to 50 hours a week impersonating the missing woman Carrie Leah. Liz's room was a mess. But no significant evidence was found. However, police did find several cell phones and electronic devices in the last room she stayed in. In late December 2016, Shanana Gollier, known as Liz, was charged with first-degree murder. Liz's attorney, James Martin Davis, hopes the case will fail because Carrie Lee's body has not been found, the murder weapon has not been found, and Liz has not pleaded guilty. There is no evidence to prove that Carrie Leah is dead. The defense team decides to hold a new trial, with Liz's guilt decided by a judge. Electronic evidence was presented along with physical evidence. The prosecution asserted that the amount of blood found on the passenger seat of Carrie Lee's car was consistent with Liz's confession. Police analyzed the memory card that Liz had been using when Carrie Lee went missing. The memory card was on Dave's tablet. Police recovered deleted images, including a photo of a human foot with a Chinese symbol tattoo. The foot belonged to a man who had died many years earlier. There was also a tattoo that Carrie Lee's mother identified as Carrie Leah. The photo was used to confirm Liz's guilt. The judge found Shauna Gollier, also known as Liz, guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to life in prison without parole. Additionally, Liz was convicted of arson in August 2013, a fire that not only destroyed her home but also killed her pet. Liz was sentenced to an additional 20 years in prison. She is currently incarcerated at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women and maintains her innocence. Carrie Lee's son Maxwell has followed in his mother's footsteps by becoming a computer programmer. Maxwell graduated from the University of Iowa with a degree in software engineering and data science and is married. Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Susan Wright. Susan Wright was born on April 24, 1976 in Houston, Texas. Her parents, Velma Sue and Jimmy Lawrence Wright, lived a simple life and raised Susan and her older sister, Cindy. From a young age, Susan was an active, friendly, and talented child. During her school years, she participated in dancing activities and aspired to become a professional choreographer. With her bright and attractive appearance, Susan had many fans. However, after graduating from high school, Susan's dream of becoming a student did not come true. But she did not give up, and after a short break, she saved money to continue her studies. For a long time, Susan worked as a dancer at a famous nightclub in the city. However, she soon realized that this job was not for her and decided to leave. She then used her savings to study nursing at night at a university. With the goal of becoming independent, Susan balanced her studies with a job as a waitress at a restaurant to support herself. However, after a while, Susan realized that a career in medicine was not the right path for her and paying for her tuition became difficult. Therefore, Susan decided to drop out of school and focus on her work. In 1997, Susan met Jeffrey Wright at the Galveston restaurant where she worked. She was 21 years old at the time and Jeffrey went to the restaurant for a meal. From then on, their romantic relationship began. Jeffrey was immediately attracted to the blue-eyed blonde's beauty and bright smile. He left a generous tip and became a regular customer. Finally, he mustered up the courage to ask for Susan's phone number. Susan recalls that Jeffrey began calling her every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Jeffrey arranged romantic dates and small surprises like sending flowers and touching notes to Susan's workplace. In the evenings, Jeffrey would meet her and take her home. Although Jeffrey was 8 years older than her, the age gap did not bother them. Jeffrey was attentive, sweet, and caring, and quickly won Susan's heart. However, Jeffrey had some problems with alcohol and substance abuse. Jeffrey said that he had given up drugs and promised to give up drinking completely. Susan, a naive young girl, believed him. Susan felt that together they could overcome any challenge. Shortly after Susan learned she was pregnant, she immediately shared the news with Jeffrey. Although Jeffrey initially expressed joy at the prospect of becoming a father, he had not made any decisions about the future. Jeffrey did not propose and they continued to live apart. Disturbed by Jeffrey's behavior, Susan insisted that their first child be born, and Jeffrey accepted her opinion. At the time of the marriage license, Susan was 8 months pregnant. Their wedding was a simple affair, with no guests or witnesses. A few weeks before the baby was due, they moved into a quiet house in Harris County, Texas. In December 1998, Susan gave birth to a son named Bradley. Just 3 years later, she was pregnant again. In the spring of 2002, she welcomed her second daughter, named Kay. Along the shore, the family also raised a small dog named Buck and had a spacious family car. Jeffrey worked for a local construction company, and after they had a daughter named Kay, Jeffrey agreed that Susan would stay home to care for the child. Friendly neighbors often praised Susan as a kind and caring mother. She created a cozy environment for the family. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect family. Every day, Susan has to spend a lot of time doing housework such as cleaning, organizing, cooking, and making sure everything is kept in a clean condition. Jeffrey does not want her to repeat the same recipes. The whole house has to be clean for Susan. Taking care of young children and cleaning the house at the same time can be considered impossible. Jeffrey's clothes have to be washed almost every day because he doesn't want to wear any of the same clothes again. However, following these rules manually is not easy. If Susan doesn't comply with his request, she will face insults, humiliation, and even physical abuse. Financially, Jeffrey is extremely frugal. Contrary to the image of a romantic man who often gives gifts and flowers, Jeffrey only gives Susan $100 a week to cover household expenses. At the same time, he also asked her to settle all expenses and provide receipts. Jeffrey also broke his earlier promise to quit drinking. However, the real problems were just beginning. Jeffrey relapsed and started using drugs again. Under the influence of these substances, Jeffrey would become aggressive and would hurt his wife and son. Whenever Susan asked Jeffrey to stop using drugs and go to rehab, Jeffrey responded with anger. Jeffrey saw no problem with his actions and believed that Susan knew about Jeffrey's drug and alcohol use before Susan married him, so she should accept it and live with it. Jeffrey's parents also knew their son's weakness and sympathized with Susan. However, they felt helpless and unable to help her. What Susan couldn't stand, however, was when her husband began to physically, emotionally, and even sexually abuse her. At first, he would apologize and promise not to do it again, but then he stopped apologizing and domestic violence became a daily occurrence. Jeffrey began boxing at the gym 3 times a week, finding that the sessions helped him relieve stress. On Monday, January 13, 2003, Jeffrey went to the gym after work as usual. When he returned home, he seemed stressed. While Susan was cooking dinner, Jeffrey decided to tell his son about the sport of boxing and teach him some basic techniques. While teaching his son boxing, Jeffrey lost control and hit the boy. The child burst into tears, and Jeffrey tried to comfort the child, hoping his wife wouldn't hear. Susan pretended not to notice, but this incident was the last straw for Susan. After dinner, Susan went to put the children to bed while Jeffrey remained in the bedroom. When Susan entered the room, Jeffrey attacked her violently. Susan thought that Jeffrey was trying to kill her with a knife. However, she reacted and realized that Jeffrey did not have a knife in his hand. Susan decided to use her dancing skills to seduce Jeffrey and lower his guard. Susan entered the room in a short silk robe and performed the dance for her husband. Susan then proposed a game, which Jeffrey agreed to participate in. In this game, Susan used 3 reins to tie Jeffrey's right hand and right leg to the bed. Jeffrey's left leg was secured with a silk strip from her robe. While Jeffrey was tied up, Susan used her panties to spank him, forming part of the intimate game. Susan gently turned off the lights. Jeffrey was now bound hand and foot, and a gag was stuffed into his mouth. The din candles were the only remaining light. Susan then moved the bubbling hot wax onto Jeffrey's chest. Susan then continued pouring the hot wax onto his genitals, and the pain quickly became unbearable. Jeffrey tried to free himself, tried to scream, but to no avail. Meanwhile, Susan continued to beat Jeffrey with a small, sharp knife she had taken from the kitchen. Susan started at the groin area, moving up and down, cutting Jeffrey's genitals, legs, stomach, chest, arms, neck, and face. At first, Susan moved slowly, complaining loudly with each slash, recounting the insults, humiliations, and abuse she had endured. Then Susan began to cry and stabbed faster and faster. Her actions showed that Susan was in a state of extreme despair and emotional turmoil. Susan could not stop even when Jeffrey showed no signs of life. Susan sat by the bed next to Jeffrey's body. However, after a few hours, Susan realized that the bedroom was covered in blood and she had to clean it up before morning. Susan carefully watched the window, making sure no neighbors were watching. At this point, Susan saw a hole in the backyard, which Jeffrey had dug over the weekend to build a fountain. Susan quickly moved Jeffrey's body from the bedroom to the yard, using a garden wheelbarrow to move it. Susan decided that the pool would be Jeffrey's final resting place. After calming down, Susan spent the rest of the day, before dawn, cleaning up the evidence of the attack. Susan had to wash the blood off the floors, walls, and carpets. The carpets had large stains that could not be removed. Susan added bleach to the stains, hoping that the chemicals would erase any traces of what had happened in the room. That morning, Susan called her husband's family in Austin, Texas, sobbing. Susan told them that her husband Jeffrey, while drinking and using drugs, had attacked Susan and their young son. Jeffrey then destroyed the house, spilling a bottle of bleach on the carpet before leaving, declaring that Jeffrey did not want to continue the marriage. When Jeffrey's parents heard that Jeffrey had been beating their son, they were shocked. They knew Jeffrey wasn't perfect, and they felt sorry for Susan. They offered to let Susan and the children stay at their house for a while, but Susan refused. Instead, Susan said she would file a police report and tell them everything that had happened in the family. Then, when Jeffrey suddenly went missing, Jeffrey's mother, Mrs. Wright, went to the police station to report the incident. Susan said Jeffrey had been violent towards Susan and the children. As a result, Susan had to file for a restraining order, which meant that Jeffrey would not be allowed near Susan and the children. When Susan filed for the restraining order, Susan presented evidence of her injuries, such as bruises and cuts on her arms. Susan said the injuries were caused by Jeffrey during a fight when he hit her with a key. Susan's children were also victims, especially Bradley, who was hit by his father and had minor bruises on his face. At first glance, the story told by Susan seemed plausible. Jeffrey, under the influence of alcohol and drugs, attacked Susan and her young son, after which Jeffrey became frightened and ran away. But over time, Jeffrey stopped communicating. And Jeffrey fled without taking his belongings, papers, and even his cell phone from home. Jeffrey did not go to work or to his parents' house, and none of his friends or neighbors saw Jeffrey. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Susan's situation is not optimistic, as she finds it unbearable to be in the house where Susan murdered Jeffrey and buried his body in the yard. Susan begins to feel as if Jeffrey is still alive and about to rise from the grave to take revenge. Susan is on the verge of going crazy, and their dog Buck keeps barking and trying to dig up the burial site. On January 17th, after dropping her children off at school, Susan went to her mother Velma's house. Her mother learned about the incident and asked Susan, "You killed your husband, didn't you?" Susan burst into tears and nodded. Susan confessed what had happened and revealed where Susan had hidden Jeffrey's body, saying she didn't know what to do next. On her mother's advice, Susan contacted attorney Neil Davis the next day and confessed that Susan had killed her husband. Attorney Davis worked out a solution and thought carefully about possible scenarios. On January 19th, Neil Davis called the Harris County District Attorney's office and reported that Susan Wright had killed her husband Jeffrey and buried his body in the backyard. Susan Wright was ready to give a statement to the police. On January 24, 2003, Susan voluntarily went to the police and stated that she would give a full confession. On January 24, 2003, Susan went to the police and confessed the whole thing. However, when she was interviewed, Susan's story was unclear and full of contradictions. Susan was confused about the details and sometimes contradicted herself. Susan also claimed that Jeffrey was still alive and that she was afraid of him. As a result, Susan requested protection. As a result, Susan underwent a psychological evaluation and was diagnosed with schizophrenia and depression. However, Susan was still able to understand her actions. Following Susan's statement, the police arrived at the scene and removed Jeffrey's body from the makeshift grave in the backyard. The medical examiner was surprised to see numerous injuries on the body. The medical examiner's team counted a total of 193 stab wounds on the body. Specifically, there were 8 wounds in the groin area, about 30 wounds in the legs, 23 wounds in the shoulders and arms, 22 wounds in the abdomen, 46 wounds in the arms, 23 wounds in the neck, and 41 wounds in the face. However, only 1 wound to the head could be considered the direct cause of death. All other cuts were superficial and did not pose an immediate threat to life. This left Jeffrey with a long and painful death. Police saw deep marks on Jeffrey's wrists and ankles from the ropes and belt Susan used to restrain him. These injuries indicated that Jeffrey had tried to free himself but was unsuccessful. Additionally, traces of candle wax were found on Jeffrey's gun and groin area. Susan claimed that it was an accident as her husband accidentally turned a burning candle on himself, but police believe the hot wax was more likely a form of torture inflicted on Jeffrey to cause pain. Susan's underwear was still in Jeffrey's mouth, acting as a gag to prevent Jeffrey from screaming or calling for help. Toxicology reports revealed traces of alcohol and several controlled substances in Jeffrey's system, suggesting that Jeffrey may have acted aggressively under the influence of these substances. The bedroom where the massacre took place appeared normal, except for a large bleach stain on the carpet, suggesting that Susan had spent a lot of time cleaning and hiding the evidence. When experts used chemicals and special equipment to detect the blood traces that had been cleaned up, a completely different view of the project emerged. Blood was found everywhere, including on the ceiling and the red blood cell cushion. The trial began in late February 2004. By that time, Susan had been in custody for a year and her children were in the care of her parents and sister Cindy. Susan's attorney had prepared extensively for the trial and worked extensively with Susan. When questioned, Susan recounted the sad story of that terrible night and the events leading up to it. Susan said she had endured years of abuse and resistance. However, when Jeffrey began abusing the children, Susan could not take it anymore. Susan recounted that fateful evening, Jeffrey came home from the gym in a state of agitation. Jeffrey then began teaching their 5-year-old son punching and fighting techniques. When the son became scared and refused, Jeffrey punched him in the face. Susan then put the child to bed and decided to talk to Jeffrey about seeking help at a clinic for alcohol and drug abuse. However, Jeffrey became angry and decided to leave, taking the keys with him. While Susan tried to stop Jeffrey, a fight broke out between the two, leaving Susan with injuries to her palm and wrist. During the attack, Jeffrey attacked her, causing her to fall to the floor and briefly lose consciousness. When Susan regained consciousness, she found Jeffrey holding a knife in his hand. Susan could not explain how the knife ended up in her hand afterward. Susan's attorney argued that Susan's mental instability was the cause of her actions, causing Susan to lose control of her attacks until she had inflicted multiple injuries on Jeffrey. Susan said she tied the rope and belt around Jeffrey's hands after inflicting multiple injuries, then used a wheelbarrow to carry Jeffrey out into the yard. As for the scraps found, Susan claimed they came from a candle that Susan had left on her bedside table that night when she had left the nightlight on. Susan could not explain why her underwear appeared in Jeffrey's mouth. The prosecution's argument and conclusion were more convincing and reasonable. Experts demonstrated that the deep wounds and abrasions on Jeffrey's wrists and ankles were inflicted while he was still alive, indicating that the binding was part of an intimate game that Susan used to lure Jeffrey into a trap. Therefore, it was reasonable that Susan's underwear had replaced the gag in Jeffrey's mouth. Furthermore, all of the wounds were inflicted at a certain angle, as if Susan were on top of Jeffrey's body, sitting on him, rather than in the midst of a struggle, which would have resulted in a different type of injury. All of the cuts were made from the front while Jeffrey was lying on his back and firmly immobilized. The question remains whether Susan planned Jeffrey's death. The prosecution claims that Susan planned the whole thing in hopes of receiving a large insurance payout. The case was widely publicized as Susan was dubbed the Blue-Eyed Butcher or the Blonde Meat Grinder by the press. Jeffrey's relatives demanded the harshest punishment for Susan. At first, people asked for a life sentence for Susan. However, in March 2004, Susan was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Susan did not think about the judge's decision and was completely emotionless. A year later, Susan's attorneys attempted to appeal the conviction, but it was denied. With new developments and a reduced sentence in 2008, Susan and her defense team filed another appeal. This time, a new witness testimony significantly affected the outcome of the case. Misty McKell, wife of former NFL champion Steve McKell, had a close relationship with Jeffrey Wright in the mid-1990s and was even engaged to Jeffrey for a year. However, Misty McKell shared horrific experiences of being physically and mentally abused by Jeffrey, causing her to abandon plans for marriage and end the relationship permanently. After considering Misty McKell's testimony, Susan's sentence was reduced to 20 years. In 2014, when she was 38 years old, Susan was eligible for parole once but was denied. Susan was also denied a second time in July 2017. Finally, after 16 years in prison, Susan was released in the winter of 2020 when she was 44 years old. Susan Wright's case was widely covered in the media and aired on the U.S. national television network Court TV. The story was later made into several popular television documentaries, including 48 Hours Mystery and The Secret Lives of Stepford Wives. In 2012, the feature film Blue-Eyed Butcher was released, starring actress Sarah Paxton as Susan Wright. Additionally, in 2014, Canadian documentary filmmaker Chloe Ballant discovered a short film inspired by Susan Wright's trial. Hi there, investigators. It's time to uncover the truth behind another case. The case of Xavier Dupont de Ligons. Xavier Dupont de Ligons, born March 9, 1961. He is the eldest son of the French Count Bernard Hubert Dupont de Lignes and his wife, Genevieve. Xavier had a younger sister named Christine. Xavier's parents were very wealthy. Xavier's mother, Genevieve, claimed to have received messages from the divine, which she wrote down during her creative writing sessions. Her strange beliefs developed into teachings about the impending apocalypse, and she founded a religious sect called the Church of Philadelphia. The group consisted of members of the aristocracy, whom Genevieve believed would survive the apocalypse and participate in the renewal of the world. Despite his father's aristocratic title, Xavier had little interest in the French tradition. Instead, he was fascinated by luxury, high-end cars, and Xavier loved the United States. Xavier's lavish lifestyle was financed by his mother through substantial donations from members of the sect, who vowed to keep their activities secret. In 1974, Xavier met Emmanuel Teneur on the beautiful island of Bra. They formed a friendship based on mutual understanding and respect. It is said that at that time, Emmanuel confessed his feelings to Xavier, but despite his rejection, their close friendship remained unchanged. 2 years later, Xavier met Agnes Hodanger in Newt Shireen, a suburb of Paris. Agnes was born on November 9, 1962, and Agnes was deeply religious. She worked as an assistant at the Blanche de Caze Catholic School in Nantes, where she taught catechism. Although information about Agnes' family is not widely available, there are many sources that indicate that Xavier and Agnes formed a very close relationship. The relationship developed into a short-lived romance before they decided to separate. In 1990, Agnes gave birth to her first child, Arthur, from a non-coercive relationship. Soon after, she and Xavier got back together, rekindled their love, and decided to marry. Xavier adopted Arthur as his son. 2 years after the breakup, they welcomed the birth of their second son, Thomas, who was considered the heir to the family. To commemorate this important event, Xavier chose Emmanuel as the first person to support Thomas. After Thomas, the couple had 2 more children, Anna and Benoit. The family of 6 lived happily. Xavier showed himself to be a loving father and his children excelled in school, opening up a promising future. Agnes passed on her faith to her children and took them to church. Around 2000, in accordance with their interests and wishes, Xavier moved his family to the United States. Xavier, a reserved, charismatic, and multilingual man, believed he could easily integrate into the United States. However, this project failed, resulting in significant financial loss. Upon returning to France, Xavier was left in a large amount of debt after several failed business ventures. Xavier was described as a salesman in some investigations. According to French media reports, financial problems had been a major concern for Xavier for many years. One of Xavier's failed projects was the importation of plans from the United States into French. In addition, Xavier also started a small business but found only limited success. These businesses included hotel and restaurant guides for sales representatives, a loyalty system for restaurants, and an association called the French Federation of Commerce. Xavier was also listed as the manager of another business that has not been clearly disclosed. Eventually, the business's accounts were few, and by 2003, Xavier had hired 6 sales staff. Xavier's work was often Monday through Friday and brought in less than $4,200 in reported annual income. The mounting financial problems began to strain Xavier's marriage, perhaps due to the usual disagreements in marriage. In 2004, Agnes wrote on a French forum about the challenges she and her husband faced, notably that Xavier had told her that the collective death of the entire family would not be a disaster. The financial situation worsened, and by 2009, the mounting debt had taken a serious toll on their relationship, forcing them to temporarily separate. During this time, Xavier sent Agnes several letters blaming her for the family's difficulties and the debts they were facing. This emotional stress affected Agnes, causing her to lose her sense of direction and suffer from insomnia. During this difficult time, Xavier sought help from his friend Emmanuel, who came from a wealthy family and had inherited a fortune from his father. Emmanuel was always ready to help Xavier financially. Emmanuel not only lent Xavier money, but also financed his trips and co-signed the purchase of a house. With Emmanuel's help, the Xavier family lived in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Nantes in the late 2000s. However, after settling down, the neighbors found Agnes to be stubborn and not easily put up with her husband. But behind closed doors, Agnes faced personal problems. She felt Xavier was too slow and unloving, and sometimes even abusive towards Agnes. She was also frightened by the way Genevieve, her mother-in-law, controlled Xavier. She described Genevieve as a mentally ill mystic and was extremely fearful. On January 20, 2011, Xavier's father Bernard died. Xavier hoped that his father's death would result in an inheritance, which would help him solve his financial problems. However, Xavier was shocked. When he went through his father's possessions, he found nothing of significance. The remaining items included a few pieces of paper, a rifle, a name tagged, a ring, and some cash, which Xavier promptly took. A few hours after his father's death, Xavier withdrew cash using his father's card. On February 2nd, he obtained a gun license, and on March 12th, he purchased a silencer for his rifle. During this time, he practiced shooting a rifle in the garden, looking at a balloon on a support stand. Emmanuel visited and tried shooting, finding nothing unusual. Xavier explained that the silencer was to avoid disturbing the neighbors. On Friday, April 1st, Xavier and Emmanuel went to a shooting range together, where Xavier's rifle was the focus of attention. The next day, Emmanuel called Xavier 5 times and they talked for almost an hour. Sunday, April 3rd. That night, Xavier, Agnes, and their children watched a movie and had a nice dinner at a restaurant. Everyone in the family was there, except Thomas, who was studying at a Catholic school and living in a nearby dormitory. After the outing, the family returned home and were seen by neighbors. Some family members also exchanged text messages with friends and acquaintances. That night, Xavier used drugs to put his wife and children to sleep, then shot and buried them in the garden. He did the same thing with the family's Labrador. Xavier called Agnes's workplace and said she was sick. He then contacted Arthur's school and said Arthur had been in a motorbike accident. He then contacted Anne and Benoit's school and said they were sick. In the afternoon, Xavier sent a letter to the restaurant where Thomas worked, saying that Thomas would resign because his father had been transferred to Australia. However, Xavier still had to deal with Thomas. On Monday, April 4th, Xavier contacted Thomas and had dinner with him at a restaurant near Thomas's university dormitory. After the meal, Thomas returned to his room exhausted. The next day, Thomas received an urgent text message from his father, saying that Agnes had been in a bicycle accident and was in a coma at the hospital, prompting Thomas to go to Nantes immediately. At midnight, a friend of Thomas's received a text message from him, saying that he was at home watching a movie with his father. Thomas was probably dead by then. About an hour later, Xavier emailed Emmanuel, arranging to meet up soon. Emmanuel responded, reminding Xavier that he had the power of attorney and the keys on the boat. Xavier went in and out of his house and even left a note on the door asking for no more mail to be delivered. Xavier then withdrew cash from an ATM, which was captured on security cameras. He paid with credit cards at restaurants and stayed at hotels under his real name. As Xavier's perfect escape began, the neighbors began to notice worrying signs. The once open windows of the bungalow had been boarded up for days. The 4 children of the Xavier family were no longer seen playing outside. The dogs were no longer heard barking, and Agnes was nowhere to be seen. All disappeared without a trace. Concerned neighbors began investigating and contacted the police. When police arrived, they discovered a nearly empty refrigerator with only a few jars of jam left. In the kitchen, a mop still had food on it, and a ring was placed on the living room table. Guitars were on the sofa, but no one was home. Police found empty picture frames, and the closet was empty of clothes. In the midst of the mystery, on April 9th, a letter appeared, sent to Xavier's family and friends. The letter claimed that Xavier had been hired by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and that the family had gone undercover as part of a witness protection program, explaining why they had suddenly disappeared and had not communicated. Suspicion and concern grew among neighbors who sensed something was amiss. Fearing for the family's lives, they urged the police to investigate further. As the case gained media attention, more details emerged. On April 15th, security cameras captured Xavier entering a small hotel near Cannes. He parked his car, picked up a bag, and disappeared into nearby woods. This was the last time he was seen. police returned to the family home Xavier on April 21, 2011. There, they discovered a new plot of land under the terrace. When they dug, police found the bodies of Agnes and her 4 children. Each had been shot 2 to 3 times and were wrapped in bags, covered with religious symbols, and carefully buried in sacks of quicklime. The family's 2 Labrador retrievers were also found buried. Despite a thorough search, no traces of blood, fingerprints, or DNA were found. Xavier became the most widely circulated person in France because of his alleged murder. His image appeared on every news bulletin. However, it seems that Xavier has mysteriously disappeared from the face of the earth. Autopsy results of 5 victims showed most of the bullets were shot in the head. In addition, traces of sedatives were found in the bodies of the children, which confirmed the hypothesis that they attacked while they were sleeping. A remarkable detail began to appear around Agnes. In the master bedroom, police discovered a device that Agnes used to control her sleep apnea, which had stopped working at 3:27 a.m. on April 4th. Because of the close relationship between Xavier and Emmanuel was called in for questioning by the police. Emmanuel cooperated with initial investigations. When Emmanuel was questioned about the exported rifle, Emmanuel initially knew about it. However, upon further investigation, the police discovered many inconsistencies in Emmanuel's testimony. They soon realized that Emmanuel was not being completely truthful. A crucial step occurred 24 hours later. Just before noon, Nantes police raided Emmanuel's apartment and seized Emmanuel's laptop. Emmanuel then revealed the real information about Xavier's export rifle. Xavier's mother Genevieve also attracted the attention of the police during their interviews. Genevieve was evasive and denied any knowledge of the Philadelphia church. The police investigation was fruitful. They discovered a copy of a complaint filed years ago by former members of the cult who fled in fear after Genevieve offered to have sex with all the men to conceive. This revelation about the cult, including the wealthy members who provided financial support, led the police to believe that this environment may have provided Xavier with material support. As a result, all former members of the Philadelphia church were questioned, and the police monitored the cult members, hoping to detect any indiscretions in conversations or emails. When the police examined the computer hard drive, they discovered many email exchanges between Emmanuel and Xavier. Some of the emails were particularly revealing about the relationship between the two. One email sent in the early morning of April 6 attracted special attention from the police. These accumulated details led investigators to the crime in which Emmanuel may have assisted Xavier in his escape. However, the police team's work has yielded results. They discovered a copy of a petition obtained years ago by former members of the sect. These people fled in fear after Christine offered to have sex with all the men to identify the chosen tie. The important revelation about this sect, including the wealthy members who provided the main financial support, has helped investigators better understand the work. They believe that this environment may have provided Xavier with the necessary support and substance. Therefore, all former members of the Philadelphia church were examined and followers of the sect were followed, hoping to find connections through conversations or emails. Despite efforts, no murder weapon was found. Xavier's cell phone records helped police track his movements in the country. Xavier's last known trace was recorded on April 15 from a security log. Based on the type of bag Xavier was carrying, police suspected that he may have been carrying a weapon. While everything suggested that Xavier might have committed suicide in the forest, the police conducted a thorough search of the dense forest, but without any results. This led to the hypothesis that Xavier might have sailed the boat to another country. Therefore, an international arrest warrant was issued on May 4. The Nantes police contacted the National Fisheries Monitoring Center to verify whether Emmanuel or Xavier owned a motorboat or a sailboat. The police did not find sufficient information, but Emmanuel was summoned to the Nantes police station for further questioning. When the police asked Emmanuel about the sailboat, Emmanuel claimed it was a coincidence. Emmanuel explained that Emmanuel had given Explorer permission to open his safe in case anything happened to Emmanuel, and that the key to the safe was hidden in a model sailboat in an apartment. According to Emmanuel, the safe contained Emmanuel's will. Despite some suspicious coincidences, the police released Emmanuel. At this point, Emmanuel was only considered a witness. However, the police decided to put pressure on Emmanuel because they suspected that Emmanuel was a possible accomplice. A key discovery was made when police examined all the checks paid to Xavier's company. A $4,200 check signed by Emmanuel, linked to a previously undisclosed bank account in Monaco. Police quickly requested account records, but due to Monaco's strict banking secrecy laws, they would only respond to requests from their own regulators. On September 28, 4 police officers returned to Emmanuel's home. After a long wait, Emmanuel showed up. Emmanuel's apartment was sparsely furnished, with empty liquor bottles scattered around, suggesting that Emmanuel lived a very isolated life. Emmanuel told the police that Emmanuel had not received any letters or phone calls from Xavier. In 2015, a journalist claimed to have received a letter from Xavier stating he was alive. However, after conducting handwriting, DNA, and fingerprint analyses, the letter did not provide any new information. A tip-off about a monk resembling Xavier led police to raid a monastery in Rab Brun sur Aran on January 9, 2018. After a thorough 2-hour search, they concluded it was a case of mistaken identity. Then, on January 18, 2019, Emmanuel died of a heart attack. That same year, authorities arrested a man they believed to be Xavier at Glasgow Airport in Scotland, only to discover it was a case of mistaken identity. Speculation has it that Xavier may be hiding in South America, specifically Argentina, where Xavier can help him avoid being noticed. Despite the passing of the years, the Church of Philadelphia still exists, with members who have been part of the church for nearly 40 years, living in seclusion from the world. Since 2011, the case has been shrouded in rumors and speculation, causing it to stall. Ultimately, Xavier was never found. The perpetrators responsible for the deaths of Agnes and her 4 children have still not been found. Hey detectives! Welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Michael Wayne Jones. Michael Wayne Jones was born on May 1, 1981, in Brattleboro, Vermont. His life was complicated and difficult from a young age. Michael witnessed his parents repeatedly physically and mentally abusing each other, and he himself was also subjected to this abuse. When Michael was young, his father went to prison for unclear reasons, leaving him feeling empty and deeply affected. His mother remarried and had another son, Dana, bringing some happiness to Michael's life. However, their home life remained troubled. Michael's stepfather had trouble maintaining stable employment, which put a financial strain on his mother, forcing her to work 2 jobs to support the family. The stepfather was aggressive toward Michael and Dana. He used physical punishment. This has created an atmosphere that makes people feel scared and controlled. Michael was harshly punished for small mistakes, such as being late to school, and was often locked in a shed and subjected to sexual abuse. Michael's difficult life did not harden him. Instead, he showed kindness and a strong instinct to protect others, particularly his younger brother Dana. He is often the one to admit mistakes and take punishment for Dana, which brings the 2 brothers closer. Dana admired Michael's courage and love. Michael's stepfather was extremely controlling and rarely allowed him to interact with other children. His mother was too afraid of her husband to stand up for Michael or herself. This created a home environment that was isolated, secretive, and oppressive. With no outside help, Michael and Dana suffered ongoing abuse. The neighbors suspected that something was wrong in the household. In a desperate attempt to escape, Michael ran away from home but didn't know where to go. He was eventually found by authorities and shared the sad story of his family life. Unfortunately, no one helped him with his situation. Michael had difficulty expressing his genuine emotions, instead concealing them beneath a facade of indifference. He struggled with depression in his teenage years, which significantly impacted his mental well-being. However, at school, he found some relief from his struggles. Despite being introverted and feeling lonely, having responsibilities helped distract him from his difficult home life. Fortunately, Michael met Dorothy, a local business owner. Dorothy introduced him to her daughter, and although the daughter's name is not known, but Michael formed a strong bond with her. As time passed, their friendship blossomed into romance, navigating its share of highs and lows. This relationship brought out Michael's gentle, thoughtful, and cautious nature, revealing a more nuanced side of his personality. Dorothy was happy to see Michael in a new light, but at the same time, she felt concerned. She observed that he became uneasy whenever it was time to go home. Despite her daughter's frequent visits with Michael, he made a concerted effort to keep her away from his residence. Concerned by these signs, Dorothy decided to have deeper conversations with Michael. Michael eventually opened up to Dorothy about his concerns for his mother and brother's well-being. This enabled Dorothy to recognize the emotional burden and suffering that Michael was experiencing. After finishing high school, Michael enlisted in the United States Navy, which marked the start of a new chapter in his life. The Navy instills in him a sense of direction and purpose within a highly organized environment. As Michael developed a strong affection for the Navy, he realized that he had made the right choice. His newfound sense of happiness is largely due to his close relationship with his teammates. Although he would occasionally drink, Michael was always responsible and showed up for work, proving to be a calm and composed individual. During this time, Michael was dating a colleague. However, he quickly realized that the relationship was unhealthy when she became violent towards him. This brought back painful memories of his childhood. As his depression worsened, he realized he needed to end the relationship. Following the breakup, Michael dedicated himself to furthering his career. He pursued specialized training in combat medical care, which ultimately led to his appointment as a medic in the Marine Corps. Afterward, Michael met Sarah, and they fell deeply in love, eventually getting married. After getting married, Michael resigned from the Marines so he could devote his time to supporting his wife. Sarah had a positive impact on Michael's life, encouraging him to make good choices. Together, they had 3 children, and Michael was determined to be a devoted father, providing them with the best possible upbringing. In their relationship, Sarah often took the lead in decision-making, but Michael was always supportive of her choices. In 2011, Sarah found a job in Orange County, Central Florida, and the family moved there. She worked at the Mount Dora Animal Hospital, which was managed by Bo Delaporte. After Michael had difficulty finding a job, Sarah convinced Delaporte to take him on. She also emphasized the experience Michael had gained from his previous job. Michael quickly settled into his new role and showed outstanding commitment. Michael emanated happiness and had a clear passion for his work. Michael's positive demeanor made him highly sought after by pet owners. His employers, particularly Delaporte, grew fond of him, and their relationship blossomed into a strong friendship built on trust. Delaporte even entrusted him with some management responsibilities at the animal hospital. In 2014, Delaporte hired KCI, a new veterinary technician. Born on December 23, 1986, in Ion, Indiana, KCI was the second of 3 daughters to Nikki and David. She had 2 siblings, named Sarah and Brandy. She brought immense joy and positivity to her family, and also spread that energy to those around her. As KCI grew older, her love and concern for those around her deepened, Fueled by her spiritual beliefs and moral principles, this gives her the strength to face life's challenges. In high school, KCI met Richard, and they were initially attracted to each other. However, as they dated, Richard noticed KCI's jealous and possessive tendencies. Her insecurity sometimes led to hurtful words and actions. Nevertheless, Richard remained patient and calm, and they eventually married after completing their studies. Over time, KCI's mother moved to Florida. Sarah and Brandy soon followed. Due to KCI's close relationship with her family, she and Richard relocated to Florida in 2009. After settling in, KCI worked occasionally as a transporter and sometimes as a dog groomer. She also began learning the trade of a veterinary technician. During this time, Casey and Richard welcomed their first child, Cameron. KCI was devoted to Cameron's well-being and made it her top priority. A few years later, Casey and Richard had their second child, Preston. The children grew in a happy environment filled with laughter and loving care. As KCI advanced in her veterinary technician career, she found a job at an animal clinic. There, she met Michael, who was Delaporte's right-hand man. Michael and KCI got along well, but Delaporte and Sarah both suspect that there may be something more than mere friendship between them. Even though both of them have families, but Michael found himself attracted to KCI. This attraction affected his focus and performance at work. Michael tried his best to satisfy KCI's needs. And she reciprocated Michael's feelings, and as a result they began an affair. Sarah and Michael decided to get a divorce, as did KCI and her spouse, Richard. After the divorce, Sarah was granted custody of her 3 children and relocated to Jacksonville. In contrast, KCI and Richard chose to share custody of their children, Cameron and Preston, according to a certain rule. KCI took her parenting responsibilities seriously and made sure to transport the children as agreed. Delaporte's frustration increased as Michael's work performance at the clinic continued to deteriorate. To make matters worse, Michael inappropriately approached other employees, overstepping professional boundaries. A betrayal occurred when Michael asked for time off, claiming his mother had passed away, only to use the leave for a beach vacation. Delaporte discovered the truth and subsequently terminated Michael's employment. Seeking revenge, Michael burglarized the clinic, stealing money, computer equipment, and even a gun. Delaporte identified Michael as the perpetrator and contacted the authorities. With KCI's assistance, Michael escaped to New Mexico but was eventually caught by the police. After serving a short prison sentence, Michael was released. Despite Michael's past actions, KCI remained devoted to him. The couple moved in together, and Michael became a stepfather to Cameron and Preston. Eventually, in 2017, around Halloween, Michael and KCI got married and started a new life together in a 2-bedroom trailer. Although the space is small, the affordable rent makes them feel grateful to have found a place where they can be together. In the same year, they welcomed their first child, Mercalli, followed by Ayana the next year. As their family grew to 4 children, Michael took on a job as a construction laborer to support them financially, while KCI dedicated herself to being a homemaker. She took great joy in every stage of her children's development and sought ways to capture those special moments. This led her to create a YouTube channel where she shared milestones of their family life. At first glance, their life seemed perfect, with Michael appearing calm and KCI's laughter frequently punctuating their videos. However, their relationship was not as it seemed. Behind closed doors, the couple frequently argued, and their disagreements had become a persistent problem. KCI's distrust of Michael led her to regularly check his phone, and she became suspicious whenever Michael worked late hours. A heated argument broke out between them on the night of July 10, 2019, while their children slept. The argument started when KCI discovered a message on Michael's phone that made her believe he was being adultery. The confrontation quickly turned violent, with KCI grabbing a baseball bat and pushing Michael. Michael then took the bat from her and, in a state of blind fury, he repeatedly struck her until she died. Michael put KCI's body in a plastic bag and hid it in a closet. He tried to clean up the scene as much as he could. The next morning, he took steps to prevent the children from finding out what happened. He then put KCI's body in his car. To avoid raising suspicion, Michael continued to post on KCI's social media accounts in the following days. On July 26, Michael sent a text to Richard, pretending to be KCI, asking him to take care of Preston and Cameron. Michael also texted KCI's mother, asking her to care for Mercalli and Ayanna. When Richard arrived to pick up Preston and Cameron, he found it strange that KCI was not there and expressed his concerns to Michael. However, Michael dismissed Richard's concerns, saying KCI had left town for a few days. KCI's mother had a similar reaction when she came to pick up Mercalli and Ayanna. Later that day, Michael called Sarah and told her that he and KCI were separating, and he needed to take care of the children while she worked. He then picked up the children and took them to his home. During the drive, the children noticed a strong, unpleasant smell in the car, similar to rotting meat. Michael continued to visit his children at Sarah's residence for 2 weeks, driving back and forth between his home and Sarah. Meanwhile, the body of KCI remained hidden in his car. As the days went by without hearing from her daughter, KCI's mother grew increasingly worried. On August 10th, Richard returned Cameron and Preston to Michael. This time, KCI's absence was even more noticeable, and it increased Michael's concern. During their brief conversation, Michael apologized for causing Richard and KCI to divorce, and acknowledged the challenges Richard went through in his relationship with KCI. As the new school year approached, Michael realized that the absence of the children and KCI would likely raise suspicions among the elementary school staff. This realization led to a tragic turn of events. On a night that remains unspecified, Michael took Cameron out of bed and suffocated him, then placed his body in a suitcase. The next morning, he did the same to Preston, putting his body in a garbage bag. A few days later, the owner of the trailer park where Michael lived served him an eviction notice, giving him 2 weeks to vacate the premises. Amidst this dire situation, Michael went to pick up Mercalli and Ayanna. When KCI's mother saw Michael again without KCI, she became overwhelmed with anxiety and had a nervous breakdown. Her mind was consumed by a single question: where was her daughter? Michael was driving with his daughters, Mercalli and Ayanna, when he was suddenly overcome with guilt. He felt trapped and decided to turn himself in at the police station. However, when he reached the door, he changed his mind and turned back home. Upon returning, he filled the bathtub with water and tragically drowned his daughters. After their deaths, he placed their bodies in a plastic container. As Hurricane Orion approached Florida in early September, a state of emergency was declared, prompting many people to seek shelter. Michael took advantage of the chaos to transport 5 bodies, including his wife and children. He loaded them into his truck and headed north to stay with Sarah. During his stay, Sarah noticed that Michael never contacted KCI or inquired about the children, which made her uneasy. However, she chose not to ask questions due to her awareness of the marital issues. After the hurricane passed, Michael's neighbors reported a strong, unpleasant smell coming from the trailer to the property owner. The owner checked the trailer, first looking through the windows and then entering it. Although the furniture and personal belongings were still there, the smell was overwhelming, but nothing else seemed out of the ordinary. KCI's mother grew desperate as she tried to make sense of her daughter's disappearance. She suspected Michael might be in trouble with the law and hiding, which could explain why her daughter was also in hiding for her own safety. Rather than waiting, KCI's mother contacted the sheriff's office and requested a welfare check at Michael's house. When officers arrived for the welfare check, they found the house empty but appeared to have been recently cleaned. However, a strong smell of decomposition lingered, contradicting the presence of cleaning supplies near the entrance. Before the officers could investigate further, the property owner arrived and asked them to leave. Meanwhile, with the bodies still in his vehicle, Michael drove out of state into Georgia. He stopped near a wooded area and disposed of the bodies of Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Ayanna. As he continued driving and checked his GPS, Michael lost control of the vehicle and crashed. Although Michael escaped without injury, the vehicle was severely damaged. The police quickly arrived at the scene of the accident and were immediately hit with the strong, terrible odor coming from the wrecked truck. They find a suitcase in Michael's truck, and when they open it, they discovered KCI's gruesome body. Michael broke down and confessed to his heinous crimes on the roadside. He also revealed the location of the children, leading to his immediate arrest. KCI's family was devastated by the news, feeling as though their world had shattered. In shock and grief, they still do not understand why Michael could have so brutally murdered his wife and children. Sarah, in particular, felt an intense hatred towards Michael, a sentiment she had never experienced before. With a search warrant and new evidence in hand, investigators went back to KCI's house. Upon entering, they were met with a strong, unpleasant odor and a noticeable reddish stain on the carpet. The agents began collecting evidence from the scene, while the autopsies were being performed to gather more information about the tragic incident. Forensic results showed that Cameron sustained a fractured jaw with no other visible signs of trauma. But a towel was in his mouth. Preston was found with a noose around his neck. Mercalli and Ayanna were found in a small plastic bag together, which also contained a baby bottle with Ayanna's name on it and a pair of pink sandals. The cause of death for Mercalli and Ayanna was determined to be drowning. KCI's autopsy results showed a severe blunt force injury to the front of her skull and face, but no other signs of trauma were found on her body. When questioned by authorities, Michael remained calm and provided precise and honest answers. Michael even thanked the police officers who arrested him and said he felt he had no other choice. Michael provided a clear and chronological account of incident from the fight with KCI to his subsequent arrest. When asked about his motives, Michael said that his actions stemmed from the harsh life circumstances he endured, which led him to believe that his decision was the only possible solution. The tragedy profoundly affected everyone involved, but it was particularly shattering for Sarah. She found it extremely difficult to accept that her children had been exposed to and had lived with someone like Michael. As a result, Sarah struggled with mental health issues after learning the truth. Michael was subsequently charged with second-degree murder for KCI's death and 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder for the deaths of the children. Michael pleaded guilty to the charges, bypassing a trial and moving directly to the sentencing phase. A 12-person jury then had to decide between 2 sentences, life imprisonment or the death penalty. The defense strategy focused on Michael's difficult childhood and mental health issues, highlighting various psychological disorders that may justify a reduced sentence. However, state prosecutors argued that the extreme brutality of the case worthy a death penalty. In January 2023, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, as required by state law. After a brief 99-minute hearing, the judge formally sentenced Michael to death. He also received a separate sentence of life imprisonment without parole for the murder of KCI. Michael's lawyer quickly filed an appeal following the sentencing. However, on April 28, 2023, the judge rejected the appeal and confirmed the original sentence. Prosecutors were pleased that justice had been achieved for KCI's family. Michael is still in prison, awaiting his scheduled execution. Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case. The case of Soni Millbrook. Soni Millbrook was born on February 15, 1981, in Memphis, Tennessee, USA. She is the daughter of Christine Millbrook Bennett and grew up in a large family with many siblings, having 2 sisters and 3 brothers. This warm and close-knit environment helped her build a special relationship with her cousin Jenny during her teenage years. Sony became a popular student at her high school. In 1998, when she was 17 years old and in the 11th grade, she met a man named Lakeith Moody, who was older than her. She soon began a relationship with him. However, the relationship was not a happy one, as Lakeith was abusive and violent, leaving visible injuries on Sony's body. Despite this, they had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy named after his father. In 1999, Sony's mother discovered a bruise on Sony's chest. When her mother asked her about it, Sony cried and confessed that Lakeith had caused the injury. A friend of Sony's also witnessed the injury, but Sony refused to report Lakeith's behavior to the police. Lakeith often controlled Sony and tried to isolate her from her friends and family. That same year, Sony moved into an apartment in the Fraser neighborhood of Memphis. One day, the management informed her of an incident at her apartment. When she arrived, she found a chaotic scene: damaged furniture, missing clothes, a destroyed television, food smeared on the walls, and personal hygiene products scattered everywhere, including under the stairs. Strangely, the mirror had the words, "Kiki loves you," with Kiki being Lakeith's nickname. Lakeith's behavior made Sony's relatives even more concerned. On October 31, 2000, Sony and her cousin, Pamela, went to a bar called The Mirage with Lakeith. While at the bar, Lakeith became aggressive towards Sony by slapping her and throwing a drink in her face. After the incident, Sony and Pamela left the bar and got into their car. According to Pamela, Sony was shaken and frightened by Lakeith's actions. Sony asked Pamela to take her home immediately because she was afraid that Lakeith would come after them. When Sony got home, she locked the door securely. An hour later, Lakeith came to the house, yelling and banging on the door. Pamela had to threaten to call the police to make Lakeith leave. Once Sony calmed down, her cousin decided to leave her alone. However, that evening, Pamela received a call informing her that Sony had been hospitalized. Lakeith had forced his way into the house, and when Sony tried to end the relationship, he attacked her. He tore off Sony's clothes and hit her on the head, face, chest, arms, and between her thighs. She suffered bruises all over her body, loose teeth, and even lost consciousness because Lakeith choked her until she passed out. Lakeith later accidentally discovered that Sony was on birth control pills, and he attacked her again. The next morning, Sony called Pamela and asked her cousin to take her to the hospital because of serious health problems. In late 2008, Sony, then 27, worked at a Christian institute. She was considered a reliable and punctual employee. Therefore, when she took time off or missed work, it was usually due to important reasons. Once, she called her supervisor to report that she could not come to work because her face was badly bruised, and she did not want the children to see it. After she asked for a day off, Director Leslie approved it. However, when Sony returned a few days later, the bruises were so obvious that the director allowed her to wear sunglasses while working at the academy. Lakeith's violence not only affected Sony and their children but also caused concern in the community. In April 2008, Lakeith was found sitting in an SUV with a gun in his hand, despite being previously prohibited from owning a gun due to a criminal record. Furthermore, he had previously served 2 years in prison for burglary and 3 years in prison for drug possession with intent to distribute. Sony tried to avoid her boyfriend, but it was almost impossible. The situation came to a head on October 6, 2008. At that time, Sony did not arrive at the academy by 5 p.m. Her sister received a text message from Sony saying that Lakeith was holding her hostage in his home and had been beating her all day. Sony also provided her home address. Sony's sister called the police. 2 officers went to Sony's house. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer since it was locked from the inside. They then called the security department to unlock the door. When the police entered the house, they saw Sony's boyfriend jumping out of the back window of the apartment. Sony stood in the hallway, crying and unable to speak because of her grief. Her 4 children were also present, making for a very heartbreaking scene. Sony's face and neck were covered in bruises and scratches. When she calmed down, Sony explained what had happened. Sony and Lakeith began arguing, and he refused to let her leave the house. She told the police that Lakeith would not let her or the children near the window. She also said that Lakeith injured one of their children by grabbing the child and preventing her from taking the child to the hospital. Sony said that her boyfriend had been both physically and verbally abusive. During one altercation, he tied a baby blanket around her neck and choked her until she lost consciousness. When the police arrived, Lakeith threatened to choke her again and said he would kill her if the police did not let him go. The police searched the area but did not find Lakeith. Sony then left the house with the children in her car. 3 days later, she filed a restraining order against Lakeith, fearing for her life and wanting to prevent any contact with him. However, she missed the hearing, and the protective order was never granted. Nearly 6 months later, on March 10, 2009, Sony was still in contact with Lakeith. That day, he was supposed to pick up the children for a doctor's appointment, but instead, he began arguing with Sony, accusing her of having a new boyfriend. The argument quickly turned violent as he slapped her and pulled her hair. She tried to break free and ran out of the apartment while Lakeith screamed and threatened to kill her. Lakeith did not catch Sony but instead kidnapped their youngest child, an infant, and drove away at high speed. A police patrol alerted to the domestic disturbance arrived as Lakeith was running away. The officers attempted to stop him, but he escaped. In early 2010, Sony, 28, was studying at Southeast Tennessee Community College. She had to stay home to care for her 5th child, who was 9 weeks old, because of poor health. In January, Sony and the children moved into the Budget Lodge in Memphis. However, on the first day Sony moved in, she and Lakeith's arguments became so loud that motel staff had to intervene because they were disturbing other guests. Sony and Lakeith could not maintain a peaceful relationship. They argued constantly, disturbing neighbors and management with the noise. On January 22, a hotel security guard witnessed Lakeith in a very agitated state. He arrived at a high rate of speed in Sony's car and then began yelling at her as she stood on the second-floor balcony with the children. In his anger, he threw a bag of groceries at her. The security guard arrived and told Lakeith not to make any noise or throw things in the hotel. Lakeith was instructed to settle the argument in his room. However, Lakeith told the security guard that he did not need to worry about it. Lakeith then locked his car and accompanied the security guard to an unoccupied room on the 3rd floor. The security guard asked Lakeith to hand over any hotel keys he had. Surprisingly, Lakeith had keys to 3 different rooms, even though he was not registered as a guest. The next day, Lakeith and Sony moved into room 222 with their children. However, the night manager asked Lakeith to leave that evening. Although Lakeith left as requested, he soon returned. The arguments between Sony and Lakeith continued for several more days until the guard asked Lakeith to leave the hotel for good. As Lakeith left, the front desk clerk tried to calm him down. The guard also warned Lakeith not to come back that night. Lakeith got into her car and drove away. Some time later, Sony spoke to Pamela and confided that she was having problems in her life. She was staying at the motel and wanted to talk to Pamela about something important. Sony said that she would call if she left the motel or if her boyfriend left first. The next day started normally. At 7 a.m., Sony took the younger children to daycare and the older children to school. Around 11 a.m., the housekeeping manager knocked on Sony's door and spoke to her through the window to inform her that they needed to pay the rent or they would have to leave. The manager returned several times that day. On a visit around 2:30 p.m., Lakeith answered the door. The room was dark. Lakeith told the manager that his mother was on her way to pick up the money. On January 27th, Sony did not pick up her older daughter on time. So the school secretary called the child's grandmother, Christine, to ask her to come pick up the girl. When Christine tried to contact Sony, she received no response. At around 6 p.m., she discovered that her other grandchildren were still at daycare. Concerned that she could not reach Sony, Christine asked her husband to pick up the younger children from daycare while she went to the school to find out what was wrong. They contacted the police and reported the incident at approximately 10:30 p.m. Later, on January 28th, the housekeeping manager re-entered room 222 and began taking inventory of the items that Sony and Lakeith had left behind. The room was filled with clothing in a large trash bag, which was then taken to a storage area. After the room was cleaned, it was ready for new guests. On January 29th, James and Rhonda Sargent moved into the room. They quickly noticed a foul odor and attempted to block it with incense, but were unable to eliminate it completely. They also discovered that previous tenants had attempted the same, as they found scented tissues in the tiles and ceiling vents. Because the smell was so strong that they reported it. On January 29th, officers from the Memphis Police Department's Missing Persons Unit visited the hotel to inquire about Sony's whereabouts, as that was where she was last seen. However, they did not enter room 222. Lakeith was arrested on February 2nd, around 7 p.m., while inside Sony's car at a shopping center. He was held for 48 hours on a charge of car theft. During questioning about Sony's disappearance, Lakeith said he last saw her on January 26th. He explained they had met in the hotel parking lot that morning after Sony had dropped off her children at school. They went into the room, had sex, and then returned outside. Lakeith then took Sony's car keys and left the hotel. He claimed Sony planned to use her welfare and student loan money to buy a new car, so he wasn't worried about keeping her car. Lakeith also said he had been living in the car since January 26th. However, investigators discovered that Lakeith had actually been staying at a different hotel. Additionally, given the snowy weather during that time, it was unlikely that he had spent the night in the car. On February 3rd, police found a debit card with Sony's name on it and several recent purchase receipts inside the car. That same day, police also searched the clothes stored at the hotel for DNA or other evidence, but found nothing. Due to the lack of evidence linking Lakeith to Sony's disappearance, he was released. Sony's cousin and her mother had to undertake the painful task of going to the hotel where Sony was staying to collect her belongings. At that time, Sony's cousin had a bad feeling but did not find any evidence. On February 4th, the police went to Sony's cousin's house and found a DVD player in Sony's wallet. Sony's cousin said they had received the items from Moody. According to the cousin, Lakeith borrowed the DVD player on January 24th under the pretext of watching a movie and drove a red car that day. When he saw Lakeith again a few days later, the cousin asked why Lakeith did not pick up the children on January 27th. But Lakeith evaded the question. When the cousin asked about Sony's whereabouts, Lakeith left the DVD player and wallet behind and left. Around that time, guests James and Rhonda Sargent requested to be moved out of room 222 because of the persistent odor. Since there were no other rooms available, they moved to another hotel. Later guests in room 222 also complained of a foul odor, despite the room being cleaned several times and the carpets being cleaned in early February. The odor persisted, only easing slightly over several days. On February 4th, homicide detectives arrived at the hotel to investigate. By this time, room 222 had been occupied and cleaned at least 3 times. As a result, the detectives were unable to enter the room to collect evidence. Instead, they asked hotel staff if they had noticed anything unusual. All staff responded that nothing was unusual. Then, on February 7th, James and Rhonda returned to the hotel and changed rooms 3 times. During one of the changes, they spent the night in room 222. While there, they informed management that the room still smelled unpleasant. To address this issue, in March, the hotel performed a more thorough cleaning of room 222. The staff cleaned the carpet, bedding, shower curtains, and window blinds. However, the results were shocking. The odor not only remained but became even more intense. The manager discussed the issue with the security guard. During the conversation, they recalled that the previous tenant, Sony, had disappeared at the end of January. The security guard recalled the events that occurred at that time and suggested that the manager check room 222 for traces of blood or cleaning agents. 10 minutes later, the manager returned and asked the guard to accompany him. What they found was horrifying. The 2 men entered the room where the manager had removed the mattress from one of the beds, leaving only the bed frame. The bottom of the bed frame had a cover. When they lifted the box spring, they discovered a large gap where anything could be hidden from view. Looking through the sturdy edges of the bed frame, they saw the unthinkable, a decomposing body. They called the police, who arrived at the scene shortly after. The bed frame was found to have many marks on it, and there were 2 pieces of broken wood near the headboard. A towel and a cloth bag were found between the legs of the body. The victim was wearing a shirt but nothing below the waist. The forensic team's autopsy determined that the cause of death was strangulation with a coaxial cable. The cable was wrapped around the neck, under one arm, around the chest, and ended behind the back. The medical examiner concluded that it would take at least 2 to 3 minutes of sustained pressure to cause death. In order to find the killer, the police collected items from between the victim's legs for analysis. The victim's shirt had an unidentified fingerprint. In addition, the scarf and the cloth bag did not belong to the victim. DNA samples that matched Sony's genetic profile, as well as that of a woman, were discovered. More remarkably, male DNA was also found on the cable, which led to the hypothesis that Sony had died at the time she was reported missing. The coaxial cable used in the case may have come from a DVD player that Lakeith borrowed from her cousin. Lakeith had been arrested by police for illegal possession of a weapon, and he was also the last person seen with Sony alive, making him a suspect in the case. He was in Sony's car when he was arrested and taken to the Mason detention facility. On March 18th, authorities launched an investigation into why the case unfolded in such a strange way. The chief of police said the victim's family deserved an explanation and acknowledged that the circumstances of the case were unprecedented, making it a shocking case of domestic violence. He also regretted that the room where Sony died had been cleaned and rented out multiple times, making it difficult for police to collect evidence. However, this explanation was met with skepticism. One of the first tenants, Rhonda, said the police should have been allowed into the room when James and Rhonda visited in January and would have found Sony sooner if they had noticed the smell of a decomposing body. Rhonda believes the police were slow in finding Sony. Following the loss, Sony's family held a funeral for her on March 24th. Sony's children were placed in the care of her sister on April 1st. They are currently trying to gain legal custody of the children. Sony's sister said that although the children were the primary victims, everyone in the family's lives was turned upside down by the loss. She pledged to take care of Sony's children, making sure they had enough food, clothes, and toys, and to keep them together as a family. She also said Sony had benefited from a social program, and she would continue to care for the children as her sister had. The card had been loaded with money before Sony went missing because she received an income tax refund. Police tracked the card's activity and found that it was in Lakeith's possession. During the surveillance, they noticed that the card was used on February 1st at a convenience store Sony usually visited to withdraw cash using her electronic welfare transfer card. Notably, this occurred 4 days after Sony went missing. Officers went to the store and requested the owner to show them the footage from their 16 security cameras. Through the footage, they observed that on the morning of February 1st, at 11:38 a.m., a man dressed in yellow conducted a transaction at the store. He used a Sony card to buy a bottle of orange juice, withdrew cash, and purchased a cigar. After making these purchases, he returned to a car driven by someone else. With all the evidence against him, Lakeith's trial began in the first week of February 2014, more than 4 years after the crime. By then, the Budget Lodge Hotel involved in the crime had closed. Lakeith did not admit his guilt. During the trial, the prosecutor portrayed the case as the tragic end of a tumultuous relationship. In contrast, Lakeith's defense attorney argued that there was insufficient evidence to establish his client's guilt. He pointed out that there were no witnesses or physical evidence to prove Lakeith's crime. The attorney also noted that the police found fingerprints on the victim's bed frame, but those fingerprints did not match Lakeith's. This suggests that someone else may have been involved in the crime. Additionally, the attorney argued that there was reason to suspect that the victim had had relationships with several other men over the years. He also emphasized that his client had never been convicted of domestic violence against the victim. Furthermore, he revealed something that the public did not know. Sony moved in with Lakeith again because she had to leave a relative's home due to a rat infestation. On February 6th, video footage showing Lakeith using a Sony prepaid card 4 days after her death was presented to the court. The defense claimed his calm demeanor throughout the transaction demonstrated his innocence, while the prosecution saw it as evidence of a cold and ruthless man with no regard for the crimes he was accused of committing. On February 7, 2014, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. On February 10, he appealed the conviction, arguing that the court had erred in considering his past acts of domestic violence and that the evidence was insufficient. On July 7, 2015, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the convictions, affirming the decision. Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of Regina Krieger. Regina Krieger was born on March 3, 1980, to parents Rondo Freeman and Dan Krieger. She was a cheerful girl, had many friends, and a younger brother named Clifton. Regina enjoyed music and water skiing, which led her to join the youth ski club at Lake Myrtle. In addition, she is also a religious person and participating in the youth group at the Lutheran Church. However, as she entered her teenage years, she began to experience unpleasant changes in her life. In June 1994, Regina's parents divorced, and she struggled to cope with their separation. The division of their property created further tension, as they could not come to an agreement. In September of that year, Regina expressed her desire to live with her father, Dan. Though initially her mother opposed this decision, she chose not to make the situation worse and ultimately agreed to let Regina stay with Dan. From December 1994 onwards, Regina lived with her father in a relatively stable environment. However, soon after, she began to exhibit changes in her behavior and lifestyle. In January 1995, Regina, a 9th grade student at Burley High School, started associating with a bad group of peers. Her parents noticed that something was off but found it difficult to get her to talk about it. Their relationship deteriorated, leading Regina to eventually cut ties with this bad company. During this period, she received support from a psychologist who was assisting her in coping with the difficulties related to her parents' divorce. They built a trusting relationship, which became a valuable source of support for her. She confided in the psychologist about her intention to drop out of school due to her poor academic performance and frequent absences. This decision was prompted by a warning letter from the school stating that she would be expelled if her absences continued. However, Regina later chose to focus on her studies and stay in school. On February 27, 1995, she expressed her desire to quit school and start working. The psychologist advocated for her with the school teacher, explaining that she was going through a difficult period. As a result, the teachers allowed her to attend certain classes where exams were held, enabling her to earn the necessary credits and avoid being held back a year. Regina seized this opportunity and planned to continue her education. On the same day, Regina returned home after a tough day at school. She lived with her father and younger brother on the second floor, while Regina's bedroom was in the basement. That evening, the family came together to have dinner, discuss important topics like school, and then they went to bed. Around 11 p.m., that was the last time anyone saw Regina alive. The next morning, February 28, 1995, Regina's younger brother Clifton called out to her since everyone else had already woken up, but she did not respond and seemed to be missing. Then, Clifton went downstairs to Regina's bedroom and discovered blood stains. But she was missing. He quickly reported this to their father, Dan, who came down and confirmed that his son was telling the truth. The bedroom was empty, and there were indeed suspicious blood stains. Dan then called emergency services 911 and reached out to his daughter's relatives and friends, hoping that she had run away to stay with someone. Unfortunately, his hopes were dashed when Regina's close friends denied that they had seen her. The police arrived quickly at the scene, but their investigation was not thorough. They only collected a blood-stained blanket and a martial arts training sword, without examining the area properly. The officers reported no signs of forced entry, which led them to believe that Regina had left home on her own and may have staged an attack. However, Dan rejected this idea, asking why Regina would go to the trouble of faking an attack and leaving behind blood stains. This explanation did not align with his perception of his daughter. Investigators took Dan's concerns seriously, launched an investigation. At that time, there were no advanced methods for analyzing human DNA, and tools like CCTV cameras were not commonly used. This hindered the detectives' ability to gather and assess evidence, which was already scarce. Initially, the focus was on the main suspects, the father and younger brother of Regina, Dan and Clifton. Both underwent polygraph tests and passed without any issues. Despite their cooperation, the father remained a suspect because the police had no other leads to follow. The father and brother stated they were asleep and did not notice anything unusual that night. Regina is presumed missing. There was enough blood in her room to suggest she had suffered a serious injury or had fought back, but not enough to conclude she was dead. It was thought that she might have escaped by hiding from an attacker or could have been kidnapped by someone she knew, as it was assumed she opened the door for the intruder. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain how the criminal entered her room without breaking down the door or windows. A crucial source of information for detectives was Regina's diary, which detailed her life experiences. The entries contained stories about her parents' divorce and the sadness it caused her. Additionally, the police found out that she had a boyfriend named Isidra, whom she had been secretive about with her family. He was identified as a Latino teenager living in Twin Falls and had grandparents in Burley, which is near the Regina family's home. Sidra was said to drive a green pickup truck. The police thoroughly examined these details and started looking for Sidra in hopes of gathering more information about Regina. However, they were unable to locate the truck, his parents, other relatives, or Sidra himself. It was speculated that Regina might have invented the boyfriend as a way to cope with the emotional struggles stemming from her parents' divorce. The Regina family was feeling hopeless and unsure of how to proceed in their search for their missing daughter. They clung to the hope of finding her alive, continuing to seek information and new witnesses. They printed about 30,000 flyers to distribute and post throughout the area. On April 15, 1995, a woman's body was discovered in the Snake River, showing severe signs of decomposition. It was located 15 kilometers from the home of Regina. Forensic experts confirmed that the body belonged to a young girl under 20 years old. By April 17, dental records were used to identify her as Regina Krieger. Tragically, it was determined that she had suffered multiple stab wounds, including a deep throat cut, leading to a violent and painful death. The case was updated from a missing person report to a premeditated murder investigation. News spread quickly throughout the small town, creating fear among the residents, who became more cautious. The thought of a possible serial killer targeting young girls heightened their anxiety, causing people to hesitate leaving their homes and to secure their doors with multiple locks. This was especially worrisome for Regina's father, who was anxious about the safety of his 13-year-old son, Clifton. Despite the community's heightened concern, the investigation made little progress, with the police receiving no valuable leads or tips. Eventually, detectives uncovered new information about the case. They discovered that Regina had associated with the wrong crowd and had met drug dealers, including a man named Gilberto Rodriguez. Authorities believed Regina's murder could be linked to a drug-related debt. At the time, Gilberto was 32 years old, and he often traveled between Burley and Twin Falls to distribute drugs. He was known to be part of a local gang and was considered dangerous. Regina bought expensive substances, making it hard to determine how much she owed, possibly hundreds of dollars, which was too much for a 14-year-old to afford. However, there is no direct evidence that Gilberto was involved in Regina's murder. Later, police received calls from anonymous informants, they claiming the dealer was involved in the girl's murder. But the callers would hang up when asked for details, fearing being identified. No one wanted to get involved with criminals, so the tips lacked specifics, and there is still no evidence against Gilberto. Detectives viewed he as merely a participant in illegal drug activities. However, the communication between Gilberto and Regina, 14 years old, has caused more suspicion. Distributing drugs to such young individuals was a grave accusation. Still, law enforcement needed important evidence to press charges. Investigators continued to examine Regina's friends, eventually they focusing on one individual, Cody, a friend of Regina's. He also bought drugs from Gilberto. On the night of the murder, Cody and Regina were also with the dealer, Gilberto. When questioned, Cody claimed Regina had spent the entire night passed out in the bathtub. However, his testimony was confusing. He appeared very anxious and changed his story multiple times, suggesting he was scared and possibly hiding something. Because of this, the police were doubtful about his statements. As a result, Gilberto continued to be the primary suspect in the case. In 1996, police were actively searching for Gilberto, who had previously been arrested multiple times in 1991 and 1993. Investigators believed he was involved in drug distribution, but they lacked sufficient evidence to charge him and secure a conviction. To catch him, the police devised a plan to set a trap. They arrested a man named Joe, who had previously bought drugs from Gilberto, and offered to overlook some of his past offenses if he would make another purchase from Gilberto. Joe agreed and bought $1,500 worth of drugs, leading to Gilberto's arrest on November 18, 1996. However, the difficulties are just beginning, as he is a cunning drug dealer who does not want to go to jail and intends to fight for his freedom. Rumors circulated about his involvement in serious crimes, including the deaths of Blake Morgan Jr. and Regina Krieger. These cases shared similar characteristics. The young man Blake was killed in his own home while he was sleeping, as attackers entered from the street. Unlike Regina, he was not kidnapped from his home. During the investigation on April 10, 1996, the police identified the criminals involved. They discovered that the deceased, Blake, was associated with pal Cody, a client and associate of Gilberto. The second attacker was Jesus, Blake's half-brother. For Jesus, Gilberto is the ideal role model. He respects Gilberto very much and is always willing to do anything Gilberto asks, completely obeying Gilberto's wishes. As it turns out, the motive for the attack on Blake was unrelated to drugs, as Blake did not use them. Instead, it stemmed from an incident involving Angeli, a girl who was dating a Gilberto at the time. She claimed that Blake had insulted and hit her, prompting Gilberto to seek revenge. This led Jesus to point a 9mm pistol at Blake's head on April 9, 1996, just 2 weeks before Regina's death. The night before, Blake had a chance encounter with a group of troublemakers in a bar. Gilberto immediately informed Jesus that he wanted him to kill Blake, whom he considered an enemy for mistreating Angeli. The criminals, Gilberto and Jesus, planned their attack carefully to avoid detection, choosing not to strike in front of witnesses. Instead, they attempted to break into Blake's house around 2:30 a.m. but left when they found no one inside. This took place the night after their meeting in the bar. They returned around 3:30 a.m. and found Blake asleep. Jesus kicked in the door and murdered Blake by shooting him in the head. It is clear that Gilberto orchestrated these violent crimes, but he remained in the background to avoid being linked to them. Later, all 2 criminals, includes Gilberto and Jesus, were arrested and charged with first-degree murder for Blake's death. However, at that time, they were not considered suspects in the Regina Krieger case. Detectives did not even attempt to compare this crime to Regina's for a reason that is completely incomprehensible. They ignored the testimony of anonymous witnesses who had contacted police by phone earlier. They also have denied rumors that the 2 cases are connected. Gilberto, the dangerous dealer, remained in prison while awaiting sentencing. During this time, the Iowa State Department of Control of Controlled Substances was attempting to discover the identities of informants. In prison, there were rumors that Gilberto had already killed 2 informants and planned to eliminate the others. On June 26, 1997, Gilberto was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but he was released after serving just 10 years. For reasons that remain unclear, the police decided to suspend the investigation into Regina's case. For many years, the files containing evidence and testimonies sat untouched in an archive locker. New developments in the investigation were made possible by Gilberto's accomplice, Thompson. Thompson kept his secret for a long time, but it was eventually revealed, allowing the police to find Regina's killer and close this brutal murder case. In 2013, a new investigator took on the case and began by reviewing all the evidence collected by earlier detectives. While examining the crime scene photographs, he noticed a bloody trail that clearly indicated Regina had been dragged up the stairs and taken out to the backyard. It was puzzling how the previous detectives had overlooked this detail. The investigator thoroughly questioned all the witnesses, paying special attention to Thompson, who was serving a life sentence in prison. Thompson, now 31, he had been incarcerated since his teenage years, and had a criminal record that included serious offenses like rape, burglary, and escape. He had even attacked the prison warden and killed a fellow inmate. The detective believed without a doubt that these criminals were responsible for Regina's murder, but they remained tight-lipped. Next, investigators reached out to one of Thompson's former cellmates, a long-term inmate who had entered prison in 2009. With nothing to lose, he agreed to cooperate with the police. His information allowed them to reconstruct the incident of the tragic night when Regina, a 14-year-old girl, was brutally killed. On the evening of February 27, 1995, Regina went to bed after 11 p.m. while her family slept, unaware of the impending horror. At that same time, Gilberto and Thompson were aimlessly driving around the neighborhood. When Gilberto remembered he had some unfinished business, he parked their car in the alley next to Regina's house to stop near her home. Thompson waited in the car while Gilberto made his way through the bushes and jumped over a fence. Gilberto entered a house through the back door, and Thompson kept watch from the vehicle. After a while, Gilberto returned and called Thompson to get out of the car. He explained that things had gone horribly wrong and that he needed help. He then went back into the house and emerged carrying a heavy object wrapped in a bloody blanket, which appeared to be a human body. Thompson assisted in loading the girl's body into the trunk, but couldn't get any details from Gilberto about what had happened. The two criminals, Gilberto and Thompson, left, but Gilberto buried the knife he used for the murder nearby. Later, Gilberto and Thompson attended a party where Gilberto casually walked around in a blood-stained t-shirt. Someone at the party might have called the police because of their suspicious behavior. After the party, Gilberto and Thompson went to a friend's house, where they changed clothes and cleaned off the blood. They then drove about 15 kilometers to a bridge over the Snake River. At the bridge, Thompson started to panic, and Gilberto pointed a gun at him, forcing him to throw the body into the river from the bridge. Thompson, scared, obeyed. Thompson returned home and locked himself in his room. He screamed in his sleep and acted very nervously. This made his family feel insecure. He was terrified of Gilberto, who had threatened him, and didn't want to reveal that he had thrown someone off the bridge. He tried to dismiss the incident as a bad dream. Later, at school, Thompson realized that Regina had gone missing from her home and everyone was searching for her. This realization made him panic because he knew he could be considered an accomplice, so he chose to stay silent. He was afraid not only for himself but also for his family, as Gilberto had threatened them too. Eventually, detectives spoke with Thompson, and he confirmed the information his cellmate had shared. Because he cooperated with the police, he was not charged in the Regina Krieger case. However, by that time, he was already serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. On February 20, 2019, Gilberto Rodriguez, a dealer who had been evading authorities, was arrested for the murder of Regina Krieger. Despite the charges, he maintained his innocence. Following his arrest, new witnesses emerged, stating they saw Gilberto at a party on the night of the murder. Some witnesses reported he was wearing bloodied clothes but had no injuries. Others claimed to have seen him burying a knife nearby. Several anonymous individuals also stepped forward, having previously provided tips to the police. In October 2021, 58-year-old Gilberto Rodriguez was found guilty of first-degree murder in the case of Regina Krieger. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It took 26 years to achieve this verdict, which brought relief not only to Regina's family but also to the entire community. Many felt safer knowing that this dangerous criminal would remain behind bars indefinitely. Hi everyone, thanks for returning. Let's unravel another perplexing mystery. The case of Donald Mellon. Donald Mellon grew up in a loving environment, enjoying a happy childhood in a wealthy family that owned a McDonald's in the western suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. He was financially well off and attracted many girls, but he longed for a real family. He shunned superficial relationships and fleeting encounters. Eventually, he met his first love, Karen Dawson. Their relationship initially portrayed an ideal picture of a happy family, where Donald was a loving father and family man who was adored by his 3 daughters. He, along with his wife Karen and their children, enjoyed a comfortable life together. However, over the years, Donald developed problems with alcohol. Despite the impact on his family, he refused to seek help or stop drinking, eventually leading Karen to make the difficult decision to divorce him. This loneliness changed Donald dramatically. His old self seemed to have disappeared completely. He now sported exotic tattoos and spent his time partying at clubs, frequenting a strip club on Bourbon Street. As a regular, the club manager introduced him to Rebecca, a 23-year-old girl who had recently arrived from Nebraska. After escaping an abusive marriage, she is looking for a fresh start with her young son. Rebecca was born in Newport Beach, California, but spent most of her childhood in Omaha, Nebraska. She describes her childhood as being in a very religious household. As she entered her teens, Rebecca recounted experiences of being molested by men. She felt a lack of closeness with her parents and experienced rejection throughout her adolescence. At one point, she was placed in the custody of the Nebraska Child Welfare Department and moved between different foster homes. This sense of loneliness followed her throughout her life. When Rebecca expressed her desire to leave Omaha, her ex-boyfriend reacted violently, throwing her across the room. She was often bruised, and when she hinted at wanting to leave, he threatened her with a gun. Feeling that her life was in danger, she decided that she could no longer stay with her abusive boyfriend. One night, she escaped and ran away to Minnesota. At a cheap motel, an employee suggested that she move to Arizona, praising the beauty of the place. Rebecca really wanted to go to this place, but she decided to wait until a better time. Rebecca found a job as a sales clerk at a shopping mall, where she met a young man and they quickly got engaged in Las Vegas. He was 19 and she was 18. Their love grew stronger, and soon after, she gave birth to a son. However, their happy story took a turn for the worse. After her husband quit his job, Rebecca faced more hardships. To support her family, she began dancing at nightclubs. Fate brought Rebecca to a strip club, where she earned a good income and was able to support her family, while a nanny looked after her son. However, returning home after work was difficult because her husband, an unemployed and often drunk man, not only relied on her but also often insulted her. Eventually, Rebecca decided to leave her husband. She confided in one of her wealthy regular clients about her situation, and he gave her $20,000 to help her escape to Arizona. To protect herself, she gave a photo of her husband to the bouncers at the club, instructing them not to let him in or reveal her whereabouts. She relocated to a new apartment in East Phoenix and switched to a different nightclub. There, she met Donald. Initially, Donald wasn't fond of Rebecca, but over time, Donald became deeply infatuated with her. He loved her so much that he was willing to welcome her and her 11-year-old son into his life. However, Donald's daughters disapproved of Rebecca, believing she had a negative effect on their father. Despite their concerns, Rebecca moved in with Donald in October 2003, and they married 2 years later. Everything seemed fine until 6 months later when problems began to emerge. Rebecca, now 36, developed an alcohol addiction, influenced by her husband. Together, they drank continuously, neglecting meals. On July 31, 2012, around 10 p.m., a visibly intoxicated Rebecca called the police. She was slurring her speech and requested an ambulance for her husband, who she claimed was bleeding heavily. The police and paramedics quickly arrived at the scene to assist Donald but were taken aback by the situation. Rebecca sat calmly on the couch with a cigarette in her hand, while Donald lay bleeding on the floor beside her. As the paramedics worked on Donald, the police observed Rebecca with growing suspicion. Her apparent indifference to her husband's serious condition raised questions. They also noticed a gun protruding from beneath the pillows next to the dog and a bullet hole in the frame of her wedding portrait on the wall. In light of these findings, the police decided to take Rebecca into custody. When police questioned Rebecca about what happened, she claimed that she couldn't remember the details regarding Donald. She stated that she had just left her room when she saw him bleeding on the floor, and she immediately called 911. After answering a few more questions, she unexpectedly fell asleep during the interrogation. Donald died in the hospital a few hours later, prompting the police to start a murder investigation. Before detectives could proceed, Donald's daughters discovered that he had left a voicemail at 2:44 p.m. In the message, he asked them to call him back, and they heard a loud bang just as the message was sent. The daughters were shocked and confused when they learned of their father's death from the police. They were heartbroken to learn that these were their father's last words. After receiving their first lead, the police started investigating the crime scene and were taken aback to discover that CCTV cameras were monitoring the house. What shocked them even more was that the entire murder of Donald was captured on video. Rebecca was left alone with Donald after her son went to sleep at a friend's house. She picked up a gun and entered the living room while Donald was recording a voice message for his daughter. He was unaware of her presence until she fired the first shot. The bullet grazed his head and struck Rebecca's wedding portrait. In surprise and pain, he screamed and fell to the floor next to the couch. Rebecca returned to her room and changed into a t-shirt. She then returned to the living room and shot her husband, Donald, in the head. As blood poured across the room, she sat on the couch next to him as he died. She lit a cigarette and watched him bleed for 23 minutes before finally calling 911. The scene was so horrific that the footage was never made public. Surveillance videos clearly showed that it was a cold-blooded murder. When questioned, her story kept changing. Eventually, she claimed that Donald was planning to hire someone to kill her and make it look like a robbery gone wrong. On July 31st, while Donald was on the phone, Rebecca overheard the plan he was discussing. In a state of panic, she grabbed the gun, went into the living room, and fired, but she could not remember what happened after that. As police dug deeper into their story, they uncovered disturbing details about the couple's circumstances. Their home was filled with excessive drinking, creating an unhealthy atmosphere for raising children. The Rebecca expressed concern for her teenage son, who witnessed everything. Together, Donald and Rebecca were on a path of self-destruction, amassing not only alcohol but also a frightening collection of weapons. They seemed to drink constantly, leading to a concerning situation. Friends revealed that Donald had been controlling of Rebecca from the beginning of their relationship. He pressured her to quit her job at a strip club. He also frequently criticized and insulted her. He even forced Rebecca to get a tattoo of his name, claiming it was a way to mark her. In April 2006, after a night of drinking at a bar, Rebecca and Donald got into an argument that escalated into a physical fight. Donald began to violently beat Rebecca. A deputy sheriff from a neighboring county happened to witness the incident and decided to follow them, calling the police for assistance. The deputy reported seeing Rebecca trying to escape from Donald, who then approached her and struck her on the head. Rebecca fell to the ground, and Donald subsequently grabbed her and attempted to take her to a waiting taxi. At that moment, the police intervened and detained them. Rebecca had a bloody nose, scratches on her lips, and blood stains on her shirt. When the officer attempted to photograph her injuries, she turned away and gave him the middle finger. Although the officer witnessed the incident, Rebecca defended her husband, insisting that he had done nothing wrong and that she had simply tripped and fallen. She told the police they were wasting their time and that she would not leave him. Donald had a small cut on his cheek and around his right eye. He told the officer that he and Rebecca were having a normal conversation. He denied it was an argument, claiming she turned to face him and tripped, causing her face to hit his. Donald was arrested on assault charges but was released shortly afterward. He also denied any wrongdoing. In December 2006, police were called to the Donald home shortly after midnight by someone who reported a domestic dispute. The caller mentioned an argument between the couple, during which Donald broke a pool table and knocked it over. A witness noted that the couple frequently had arguments that became violent. When the officers arrived, they found the couple arguing in the dressing room. Donald was standing over her, yelling, while she sat on the floor in tears. Rebecca refused to explain why she was crying and even declined to give the police her name. She yelled at the officers to leave her house, which led to her arrest on suspicion of obstructing justice. By March 2011, the Donald had relocated to West Phoenix. The police arrived after someone triggered the alarm. Donald informed the police that his wife had injured her face. He was unsure who activated the alarm but suspected it was the dog. In the bedroom, the officers spoke with Rebecca, who gave her name. She looked at a female officer and whispered, "Help me." As is routine, the officers began asking questions to assess her situation. After a brief conversation, the officers concluded that Rebecca was in danger and arrested her husband on suspicion of domestic violence. When the officers told Rebecca that her husband had been arrested, she became angry and said, "You don't know what you just did to me," Rebecca cried. "He's going to kill me." The officers offered to take her to a relative's house or a shelter, but she refused. They left a domestic violence flyer on her bed before leaving. In the summer of 2012, Rebecca told her psychologist that her husband had become extremely paranoid and suspected that she was plotting against him. By that time, the Donald were living in a $400,000 home in the Willa area of downtown Phoenix. Rebecca mentioned that Donald had changed the locks, and only he had a key. She also noted that he had installed cameras throughout the house to monitor her. A subsequent investigation revealed that the surveillance camera system had been installed after their home had been burglarized, with cameras positioned both inside and outside the property. In late July 2012, Rebecca decided she wanted to leave her husband. She claimed he had broken her iPod, damaged her phone, and locked her inside the house. During a session with a psychologist, she expressed feeling trapped and hopeless. On the night of July 31, 2012, they hosted former neighbors with whom they had a good relationship. The neighbors noticed Rebecca was drinking heavily and voiced their concerns before leaving, which upset her husband. Rebecca claimed that she and her husband had argued that night. She said he threw her across the room, leaving her scared and having to reach for a weapon. The incident was not caught on surveillance cameras, however. Police discovered footage that showed multiple instances of violence, both from Donald and sometimes from Rebecca. Their relationship was tumultuous, marked by intense emotions, conflict, and years of violent arguments. Surveillance cameras captured multiple instances of Donald pushing Rebecca to the ground, hitting her on the head, and occasionally choking her. On one occasion, he even grabbed her legs and threw her into the pool. After her arrest, Rebecca claimed she acted in self-defense. But it was clear that Rebecca had fired the shots. In a reduced sentence, Rebecca pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. During her trial, she admitted that she had been drinking that night and could not remember what happened afterward. While he lay bleeding, she sat and calmly smoked a cigarette. Moreover, the trial revealed undeniable evidence. A video of the incident was shown in court, leading the jury to convict Rebecca of first-degree murder. She received a life sentence in prison, with the possibility of parole in 20 years, making her eligible for release in 2032. After her sentence was announced, Rebecca expressed her sorrow. Rebecca was escorted out of the courtroom, trying to approach her son while repeatedly telling him that she loved him. She kept her eyes on her son until the door closed behind her. Custody of her son was granted to his maternal grandmother. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Rosalia Jara. Rosalia Daniela Jara was born on September 12, 1997, in Fort Ole, a small town in the Vera department of Santa Fe, Argentina. She grew up in a close-knit family with limited means. Her mother, Liliana Jara was the head of the family. Rosalia spent her childhood and adolescence in Fortin, where she attended primary school in a neighborhood called San Jose Obre. She aspired to become either a teacher or a police officer. She is known to be kind and thoughtful, especially to her family. When she was in 6th grade, she met Juan Oscar Valdez, a teacher, and they quickly secretly dated each other. At the time, she was only 13 years old, while Juan was 32 and married. Rosalia only shared this relationship with her sister, and her mother only found out when she became pregnant. After Rosalia gave birth to a daughter named Alma, Juan distanced himself and refused to acknowledge Alma's as his child. About a year later, Rosalia began living with a man named Aldo. There was a large age difference between them. This relationship did not go very well, and after another conflict, they decided to break up. On Saturday, July 1, 2017, Rosalia visited her mother Liliana, asking her to take care of her 2-year-old daughter, Alma. After that, Rosalia left home, taking very few belongings. Liliana assumed that Rosalia would be back soon, but that was not the case. That evening, Rosalia wears a red sports jacket, blue jeans, and new pink sneakers. Rumor has it that she went out to play cards with the US $20 she borrowed. She claimed she needed to make some money and wanted to try her luck. Around 9:00 p.m., Liliana called Rosalia, who said she was at a bar, enjoying the evening with friends while playing 5-card stud poker. She didn't mention anything concerning during their conversation, and this was the last time they spoke. Around 10:00 p.m., Rosalia was seen leaving a bar while talking on her cell phone and heading towards a checkpoint. After midnight, her mother, Liliana, tried repeatedly to reach her, but received no response. The following day, her mother went to the city police station to report her daughter, Rosalia, missing. Liliana found it unusual that she had not returned home, as Liliana knew how much her daughter valued family. However, the police were not interested in what Liliana said and refused to conduct a search. They argued that Rosalia, 19 years old, may have voluntarily left home. Days passed, and local authorities took no action to find Rosalia. A week after she went missing, local feminist groups organized a protest to pressure law enforcement. On the 11th day since she disappearance, authorities finally began search operations in Fort Ole and nearby areas. They conducted a careful search of the area and eventually discovered several items believed to belong to Rosalia. However, these findings did not help them find her. It is worth noting that after Rosalia went missing, most of the authorities' attention was focused on Juan. The police discovered that he left his home around 9 p.m. on July 1, driving a white Toyota Corolla, which partially matched the route Rosalia was believed to have taken. He returned home after 1 a.m. Witnesses near the bar reported seeing a similar white car with tinted windows around that time. Apparently, Juan was aware that the police suspected him of being involved in Rosalia's disappearance, which explains why he damaged his phone right before the authorities confiscated his phone. Rosalia's call history and phone location analysis revealed some important information, data related to Juan. On the night of her disappearance, there were about 20 calls between their 2 mobile numbers, most of which were initiated by Juan. Additionally, geolocation data from antenna signals indicated that Rosalia's and Juan's phones were close to each other at one point. Additionally, GPS data also showed that Juan's car was in the area during that time. Based on evidence and testimony from several witnesses, Juan was arrested in late July 2017. In early August 2017, the police organized a series of operations to clarify the chronology of incident related to Rosalia's disappearance. A representative of the Ministry of Security confirmed that during these operations, several searches took place simultaneously. One search took place at the local health department, while 2 others were organized at the homes of several police officers who were later suspected. The main goal of the search at the medical center was to find evidence suggesting that Rosalia may have had an abortion shortly before she went missing. However, this hypothesis was dismissed. Meanwhile, the search for Rosalia, the missing girl, continued. The main suspect, Juan, refused to testify about his relationship with her and about the many calls he made on the day she was last seen. In April 2018, during a hearing in the city of Vera, the judge rejected a request from Juan's lawyer to allow him to remain free. The judge decided that he should remain in custody indefinitely, as there was still a risk that he could influence witnesses. However, Juan's lawyer stated that the prosecution lacked evidence to link he to the crime. The lawyer emphasized that he had been cooperating with authorities from the start. The lawyer also dismissed the prosecution's claim that Juan intentionally damaged his phone to destroy evidence. On August 26, 2018, two hunters discovered human remains near a stream in the city of Londrina. The remains included a skull and several bone fragments. Alongside these, a pink sports jacket, sneakers, and other personal items believed to belong to the victim were found. Rosalia's family identified most of these items. The remains were sent to the Institute of Forensic Medicine for anthropological analysis. Police then went to the home of Aldo, Rosalia's ex-boyfriend, where she had lived prior to her disappearance. With Aldo's permission, they searched the house for a lock that matched a key found in the sports jacket's pocket. However, Aldo explained that he had to break the front door locks because he had not lived there for a long time and didn't know where his keys were. On September 8, 2018, investigative police officers conducted several procedures related to this case. The first procedure took place at the Municipal Health Service Department, where blood samples were taken from Liliana and her granddaughter Alma. The aim is to determine whether their DNA matches that of the remains that have been found. The Argentine Institute of Forensic Medicine confirmed that the remains found belonged to Rosalia, with a nearly 100% probability. Although forensic experts were unable to determine the cause of her death, it was clear that she had been murdered by violence, as evidenced by severe injuries to her left cheekbone, which had destroyed her skull. For Gustavo Monzon, the prosecutor in charge of the case, the evidence collected became a crucial step in the investigation. After completing all procedures, Rosalia's remains were returned to her family for burial. After it was confirmed that she had died from physical abuse, the State Attorney General's office decided to change the crime classification to homicide. More than a year and a half after her disappearance, the case finally moved to the public trial stage. In 2018, Juan Valdez was charged with Rosalia's murder. His lawyer has objected to this, arguing that the actual reasons for Rosalia's death were not determined. After hearing this, the court ordered the exhumation of her remains for further examination. Several months later, the original judge was dismissed due to allegations of bias against Juan. On July 2, 2019, the new judge began reviewing the case and denied Juan's attorney's request to revoke the pretrial detention order. Local media have been regularly reporting on key points in the investigation. In particular, Attorney General Gustavo Monzon has suggested that Juan killed Rosalia simply because she asked for child support for Alma, whom Juan acknowledged as his child. Gustavo claimed that just a day before Rosalia's disappearance, she had called Juan to voice her frustrations about his refusal to help with child support. Returning to the trial, it is important to clarify the prosecution's main hypothesis. On Saturday, July 1, 2017, while Juan's wife was away, he contacted Rosalia to discuss their meeting. As previously mentioned, he and she had multiple phone calls that day, with the last call initiated by Juan. This call lasted no more than 30 seconds, but it was enough for he to specify the exact time and place for their meeting. It is believed that when he met she, he used force to make her get into his car and turned off her mobile phone. From that moment on, her phone no longer had a signal. According to the timeline created by the prosecutors, Juan drove towards the municipality of Landry. At some point during the drive, he allegedly struck Rosalia on the head, leading to her death. He then drove a few more kilometers to a stream to dispose of her body. During the hearing, the prosecutor presented all the evidence related to the case. In addition to the report from the experts of the Institute of Forensic Medicine, the prosecution had witness testimony, autopsy reports, DNA analysis results, and forensic reports. The case documents include information from telephone company, such as call records, text messages, and geolocation information. This information fully corroborates the main version of the prosecution. Additionally, the prosecutor's team had testimony from Juan's 20-year-old stepdaughter, Macarena. She said that Juan left home around 9 p.m. that night, and she did not see him return. This contradicts Juan's testimony, which states that on the day of the incident, he went to bed early and did not leave the house. Another piece of indirect evidence presented by the prosecution was related to Juan's inappropriate behavior towards teenage girls. This evidence was based on the testimony of a female student. She reported that he had subjected her to indecent acts when she was just 12 years old. Additionally, there was other evidence that Juan had problems at the school, where he occasionally taught, all related to his relationships with minors. In November 2019, Rosalia's family changed their lawyer. By March 2020, their new lawyer, Caroline Walker, stated that after reviewing the case documents, she discovered that the investigation had overlooked several important elements. Curiously, Juan was not prosecuted for sexually assaulting Rosalia, even though their romantic relationship started long before she turned 18. Caroline also realized that as she gathered evidence against Juan, he was clearly a dangerous predator. For this reason, she did not rule out the possibility of future cases related to these crimes. The main trial took place at the Vera Municipal Court on Tuesday, July 7, 2020. This was 3 years after the disappearance and 2 years after the discovery of Rosalia's remains. Only the main representatives of the parties attended the trial. Other members, journalists, and many experts were in other rooms of the court. Given the case's significance and the announced restrictions, various feminist groups supporting Rosalia's family requested authorities to broadcast the trial daily. In his opening speech, Prosecutor Gustavo stated that he would seek a life sentence for Juan. There were several reasons for this decision, the most important of which was that Rosalia had been in an unequal relationship with him. Juan not only controlled her, but also dominated her in social relationships. Furthermore, he has consistently failed to acknowledge their common child, Alma. Therefore, the punishment Gustavo proposed, that is, life imprisonment, was entirely appropriate to the extent of the damage Juan had caused to all members of Rosalia's family. Caroline Walker, the lawyer representing Rosalia's family, criticized the authorities for their initial response when Rosalia was reported missing. She noted that the authorities were initially not proactive in searching for Rosalia and did not take the case seriously. Additionally, she stressed that Rosalia's remains were not discovered by law enforcement officers, but were found by 2 hunters. She also said that in her opinion, a police officer informed Juan about the investigation. This led to some important information being leaked, which could have helped him disappear just before his arrest. The trial lasted about a month and featured around 100 expert testimonies. Details of the phone calls between Rosalia and Juan on the day of her disappearance were also presented. It was revealed that he made the last call shortly after she left the bar, and her phone was turned off soon after. Several witnesses reported seeing a similar white car near the bar that evening. Juan was also seen leaving the house around 9:00 p.m., and a while later he came back. Prosecutors argued that this brief time frame was sufficient for him to commit the crime and dispose of the evidence. Additionally, another important piece of evidence was geolocation data from the phones, which showed that Juan and Rosalia's phones were in close proximity for a period of time. the prosecution delivered a strong closing argument, presenting both direct and indirect evidence that confirmed Juan Valdez's guilt in the crime. They firmly believed that Rosalia's life was ended due to a violent act by he, although the exact cause of death was not determined. But forensic experts believed that she could have died from a severe blow to the left cheekbone. Juan also had the opportunity to defend himself. He attempted to dispute all the evidence presented by the authorities, particularly denying allegations that he intentionally damaged his mobile phone. Furthermore, Juan argued that the authorities had made a serious mistake by focusing on him, which had led to a failure to identify who had actually harmed Rosalia. On August 3, 2020, the much-awaited verdict was announced. The court found Juan Oscar Valdez guilty on all charges. He listened to his sentence with his eyes downcast. Outside the courtroom, many young people from various human rights organizations had gathered to show support for Rosalia's family and to follow the trial's progress. Shortly after the guilty verdict, Juan's lawyer filed an appeal against the trial court's decision. During the appeal, Juan's lawyer argued that the prosecution had not presented clear evidence to prove that Rosalia had actually gotten into Juan's car on the day she disappeared. Additionally, the lawyer also argued that Aldo, her last boyfriend, whom she had accused of sexual assault, was the one people should suspect. The defense also stressed that the fact that Juan had a daughter with Rosalia did not prove that he had a motive to commit a serious crime. The prosecution aimed to counter the arguments made by Juan's lawyer. They said that from the beginning of the investigation, they considered many theories, but all were discarded when the evidence pointed to Juan as the perpetrator. Caroline Walker, the lawyer representing Rosalia's family, agreed with the prosecution's position. On October 7, 2021, the Vera Court of Appeals issued a unanimous 3-judge decision. They did not accept the appeal and request to overturn the sentence that Juan's lawyer had filed. Therefore, the previous judgment of the trial court, according to which Juan was sentenced to life in prison, remained in place. In addition, the prosecutor's office was asked to conduct an internal investigation into the misconduct of some of the police officers involved. Rosalia's case became a symbol of solidarity and feminist movements in the northern province of Santa Fe. It highlighted the issue of gender violence in local media and sparked discussions during political debates. Although Rosalia's family achieved justice, it did not erase their pain.